I've said you're going to be standing before the amendments. Yeah.
I would like to call on Robert Hammond, Chair of the Business Committee, to speak to us.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, a quick a notice. The order paper 5 for this afternoon's session was emailed to members by Synod Support this morning at about 9:15. A printed version of that will be available later, and it will be put on the app as soon as possible. And can I just take this opportunity to thank staff for the incredible amount of work they've done for preparing for everything for us. Chair, I'd like to propose a variation in the order of business. Because we were unable to complete item 520, the draft miscellaneous provisions measure, yesterday, I would like to propose that we resume that debate after item 10 this morning.
That has my approval. Does it have the approval of the Synod? Please show. Thank you. It does.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Synod. We come now to item 10. Members will need GS 2287 for this debate. We have a number of amendments and a significant number of people who would like to speak in this debate. So from the outset, I'm going to be lowering the minutes, the speech limit. I will also be asking that we address the amendments straight after the mover has moved the debate. May I call on John Spence, please? You have up to 10 minutes.
John Spence, Archbishop's Council 467. Good morning, and may I thank those members of Synod who, given my skin colour, have been inquiring after my health. Yes, I have been on holiday. Yes, I did have a good time. And yes, it felt like an eternity waiting for the moment when I could leave the hot sun in order to spend the week with you. This morning's debate on the cost of living is not a hot sunshine topic, but it is a hot one. The motion before you has 4 lettered paragraphs, and could I say at the outset that I am minded to accept all the amendments this morning. Firstly, because they contain many good points which enrich the wording of the motion, and secondly, because I would rather we had a debate on the real substance of the matter rather than in particular words. In that first paragraph, reminding ourselves of the importance of prayer, both for those in need, but also for those who seek to address symptoms and resolve the issues. Secondly, our commitment to action with Helen and Peter's amendments enriched so that it is individual and collective action across the whole church ecology to include schools and chaplaincies. And then thirdly, at the very centre of this motion, the call on government to recognise that this is an issue which is beyond the scale of government themselves, that they do need a very strong voluntary and community sector and faith sector, and that needs to be resilient through generous policies. And fourthly, the commendation for what's already been done to try to ease the lives of those who work for the church, who give leadership to their local communities, but with Robin's amendment, enriched to remind us that that is an ongoing commitment that all of us must continue to address. But it's actually in the preamble that I'd like to start. We are not today debating those factors which created, through the post-lockdown demand surge, the post-lockdown supply chain difficulties, or that war in Ukraine, that created this perfect inflationary storm. Nor are we debating the actions government is taking to try to squeeze inflation out of the system. Now, I think we all understand that it is through a low inflation and higher growth economy, with growing levels of good quality and well-paid employment, that eventually you will bring back into balance the ability to match demand with the government financial situation to meet that demand. What we are addressing is the here and now. What's happening to members of our own worshipping communities and the communities in which we all live. It was several prime ministers ago, but not many years, when the focus was on the jams, the just about managings. Well, we can be sure that however many jams there were in 2017, there will be more today, and that some of them will have slipped from jams to NEMS, the not even managing. And this is not a short-term issue. Let me make 4 points. Firstly, whatever the government does to achieve a reduction in inflation, it will not bring back the damage to the household incomes and finances that has been done due to the crisis we have faced. Secondly, we have not seen the worst of this yet. As every month goes by, as households seek to balance their energy and food costs against their available income, so more and more will reach the point where savings are exhausted, credit card capacity is exhausted, and they get into that piece where they are in what we would describe as deprivation or poverty. And thirdly, that once families and individuals, thanks again, Robin, for reminding us it's not just families, but people generally, once people are in a situation of deprivation, it becomes very hard to get out of it, and that with deprivation come long-term implications Children born into deprived households are much less likely to be school ready by the age of 5, and if they're not school ready, they will never have the ability to, or very unlikely to have the ability to achieve their full lifetime capabilities. Deprivation can be linked to premature mortality and to the ongoing onset of chronic illnesses and to disabilities. These are long-term major factors which we will live with for decades to come. And fourthly, given the other hats I wear beyond this place, we were already seeing the post-COVID harvest, a dreadful harvest of increased levels of mental illness and frailty, with referrals running at record levels from people ever younger, but across all sections of the community. So absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, we need to commit ourselves to prayer. It must never be sidelined because of the necessities of other parts of our lives. Prayer must be at the centre of all we think about and do. But equally, we must commit to individually, collectively, and across the whole church ecology to that action. We may beat ourselves up sometimes, we worry about things, but we remain the biggest single force for social good in this country when our efforts at parochial, chaplaincy, school, diocesan level, deanery levels are taken all together. Tens of thousands of social impact pieces of work are underway through the Church of England. We must commit ourselves to continue doing so. And thirdly, we need the government to recognise the vital role of the voluntary faith and community sectors with generous policies. And again, we haven't seen the worst yet. As every month goes by of household and personal budgets being squeezed, so it will become more difficult for people to commit to what they regard as discretionary giving, that which goes beyond the needs of their immediate family. As a church, we're already seeing giving, as measured by parish share, down 7% in 2022 against 2019, and that's in excess of 20% reduction of spending power in real terms. It is estimated that many charities will lose anything up to 60% of their income this year due to the squeeze on wallets and purses. So we do need government to recognise that whole system approaches are required, that the funding needs to be there that enables the resilience of the sector. But equally, ladies and gentlemen, we need to respond with whole system thinking. Your briefing papers talk about the Warm Welcomes initiative. And I've seen this on the ground, and it's been wonderful to see churches, parish councils, other councils, voluntary groups, and the public sector coming together to create networks of places where people can go to receive warm welcomes across the week, a collaboration where communities are well served by a collective rather than by organisations which might appear to be in competition with each other. But I'd like us to go further. Some of us have gone to the all-party political groups on faith, chaired by Stephen Timms MP, and seen the work of faith covenants in practice. There will be a faith covenant somewhere near you between the local authorities and the church, and the churches, denominations and different faiths, but typically with the Church of England in the vanguard. Some of those are so strong, I think of Lancashire in particular, parts of Lancashire, where the strength of the relationship between local authorities and the churches is so strong that the provision of services becomes seamless, where it is just natural for the local authority to turn to the churches for their expertise. The recognition that if you're really going to address issues of mental illness and frailty, removing loneliness and social isolation is critical, and no one is better placed than us to do so. And then I would talk about the integrated care systems and partnerships, of which the government has created 42 across England. They are statutory bodies created on the 1st of July 2022. They have a legal requirement to address the wider determinants of health, which includes deprivation, things like poor housing, where Bishop Gooley is so involved, other aspects of the issues that will cause long-term health-limiting factors. And they are required by law to create partnerships with all parts of their local community, including the voluntary, community, faith and social enterprise sectors. If we're going to come on the government to think about things in a whole system and to be generous into our sector, we need to be generous and imaginative in our thinking about how we get involved. And I will merely say to you that as somebody who sits on 3 of those integrated care system partnerships, straddling Hertfordshire, Essex, Southend, Thurrock and Suffolk, I regret to say that I am not seeing the Church of England play the sort of role I would like us to be playing. And the final element of this motion, again, commending the work that's been done to ease the pressures on the lives of those who give themselves to the Church for our work and for their local communities, and a recognition that we must continue placing that at the very forefront of our thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, the cost of living, particularly given the squeeze on family incomes and personal incomes at the same time, is a real issue. And we have the ability today to debate seriously the thrust of this in the recognition that we are so critical to the resolution and the addressing of the symptoms that emerge from this, and that we are very well placed both to call on government through the advocacy of the Lord Spiritual, through dioceses and other deaneries within faith covenants and conversations with local authorities, and through those integrated care systems to play a real role in achieving the generosity of policy which is at the heart of this motion. I beg to move the motion standing in my name.
As indicated earlier, I would like to move immediately to the amendment. So I'm now going to call Mr. Robin Lunn to speak to and move item 37.
Robin Lunn, Worcester.
Sorry, you have up to 2 minutes.
Ooh. Robin Lunn, Worcester, 432. With your permission, Chair, if I can speak to both my amendments and allow more people to speak, but I just moved the first one.
That has my approval.
Thank you. When settling this distinctly unhostile amendment, I want to make clear immediately that I fully support both the motion and its sentiments and will be voting enthusiastically for it. I thank Canon Spence for accepting both the amendments. At a time when there are apparently 93 food banks in Surrey, and the recent Liverpool Victoria Financial Survey declared that 5 million people cannot pay their bills, and up to another 25 million are experiencing some discomfort in this area, we need to be both highlighting the challenge and what we can do about helping. It was just that I thought that mentioning the Ukrainian war specifically, to the exclusion of all other external factors facing the current government, was both unnecessary and frankly misleading. It implies that by mentioning it, the Ukraine war is the major economic factor, when actually I would argue there have been many others. Again, please do not think that I am in any way belittling the Ukraine war, which is an appalling and totally avoidable tragedy caused by the Russian invasion, and it is a great pleasure to see that President Zelensky is visiting the UK today. Turning to the wording of the motion, it is more appropriate to leave this phrase out, as I don't believe in economic terms that the Ukraine war has had more impact than a host of other matters. COVID, Brexit, huge increase in energy prices, which were happening in the autumn of 2021, months before the war broke out, and excess demand over supply, which led to increased inflation. The Chinese zero COVID policy, until recently, was a major factor here as well. To just mention the Ukraine war is just a bit too convenient and plays into a narrative that it has not been for the events of February the 24th last year, everything would be rosy in the garden. I am reminded of a sketch on the Radio 4 comedy programme Dead Ringers at the end of last year, which was a government minister appearing on Newsnight. On being thanked for coming, his response was, "Yes, no thanks to Putin," which rather captured a sense of blaming every ill on one matter rather than the more complex range of issues. I instantly thought of that sketch when I read this motion and thought that that line should be removed. I'm not exactly Piers Morgan's biggest fan, but I thought he struck a chord back in October on Question Time when, in response to a government minister blaming Russia and the war for all our cost of living problems, retorted, Well, it was not Vladimir Putin who stood at the dispatch box on September the 23rd and delivered an economically illiterate financial statement which cost the country billions of pounds. Those billions of pounds would have helped enormously in mitigating the human suffering of this crisis. This is not 2020 hindsight, by the way. In my day job, I am a financial planner. Pretty much every financial planner in the UK would agree to the statement of September the 23rd with open mouths. Truly, to quote Michael Gove, it was a holiday from economic reality. And they would have been open-mouthed again, I dare say, to wake up on Sunday morning to hear the former Prime Minister bemoan the fact that she was not warned about the impact the statement would have on gilts and defined benefit pension funds. I would have thought that pretty much any financial planner or any person who has ever served on a pension committee could have told her. I would also urge Synod to make a simple change, removing the word families with people. Many single people, widows and widowers, are caught in the cost of living trap, and to simply mention families would appear to exclude them, which I can tell is not the sentiment of the motion at all. We must unite behind this motion, hopefully amended, to show what we are doing and to call for the fairness for the burden to be spread and not concentrated. I dream of the day when there will be no food banks in Surrey, Worcestershire or anywhere else for that matter. Only then can we rest in our endeavours. I move my First Amendment. Thank you, Synod.
For the eagle-eyed, you would have noticed that he had more than 2 minutes as he was speaking to both of his amendments. Thank you. I now call on John Spence to respond. You have up to 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I am happy to accept Amendment 1.
Thank you. Item 37 is now open for debate. Lynn Nichols. Up to 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Lynn Nicholl, Worcester 433. Thank you for calling me. I would encourage you to support this amendment brought forward by my colleague Robin that seeks a change of wording by deleting families and inserting people for one simple reason. I don't think the word families captures the breadth of the impact of the cost of living crisis. The Office for National Statistics definition of a family is a married, civil partnered or cohabiting couple with or without children, or a lone parent with one child. I would absolutely agree that many families within this definition are severely impacted by the deepening cost of living crisis. However, I'm certain that the impact of the crisis goes far wider than those included within this definition. I worship at a church in the deanery of Greater Dudley in the Black Country, where the household income of the community compared to the national average is low, and where I know the cost of living crisis is having a severe impact. This week, we learnt that the Black Country Food Bank is running short of food, a situation no doubt mirrored across other communities in the UK, demonstrating the deep impact of the cost of living crisis. However, that impact is felt by many different types of households. For example, it impacts on single people with limited income, with increasing costs of fuel and food. It impacts on a single person caring for the elderly relative who needs to keep their home warm. And I'm sure you can think of many other examples of households who do not quite fit into the definition of a family used by the ONS. So, Synod, I would encourage you to support this amendment that seeks not in any way to underestimate the impact of the crisis on families, but by using the more inclusive term people, seeks to emphasise the breadth and depth of the impact of the deepening cost of living crisis on people in diverse communities and households in the UK. Thank you.
Prosecutor, you have up to 2 minutes.
Kate Wharton, Liverpool 157. Thank you, Chair. I also want to speak warmly in favour of this motion and particularly of this amendment. I speak as someone who is part of a church that has no money, in a community that has no money, in a city that has no money, and I'm sorry to tell you, Bishop John, in a diocese that has no money. I see the effects of the cost of living crisis all around me, the poverty that people are faced with, affecting their ability to pay for their heating, for their food, for their clothing, for the basic necessities of life. It's often assumed that for single people this burden is easier. There is, after all, only one of us. I know personally, if I could speak very honestly for a moment, that I could not have paid my own energy bills this winter without support. It has been a cold winter in the vicarage. Also want to just mention that F word, not that one, obviously, the family word that I speak about so often when I talk about singleness. It's been my calling and my joy for the last 10 plus years to speak, write and act on behalf of single people. Of course, there is only one of us, but some of us have children, and even when we don't, there are still many costs for us. We still have to heat our house. We still have to buy food. We lose out often on economies of scale. Don't start me on those 2-for-1 offers in the supermarket. I can't eat that many satsumas. Society and the government often feel as though their language around families is very excluding to us. I'm very grateful to Robin for his amendment, only a little bit annoyed that I didn't think to bring it myself. I fully support this motion and indeed this amendment. Thank you.
I'm going to call on the gentleman standing, and afterwards I will be testing the mind of Synod for a closure on item 37. You have up to 2 minutes.
Good morning, Synod. Alex Frost, Blackburn 68. First of all, I'm disappointed that there are so many empty seats in this chamber as we discuss the cost of living crisis this morning. I'm embarrassed to be part of this synod that gives so little attention to such an important matter. I want to support this amendment and this motion, and I want to draw you to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report released just a few days ago, which suggests that 28% of children are living in poverty in the United Kingdom. And in the context of my own diocese in Blackburn, in my own parish in Burnley, I want to draw out some stark realities for you here this morning. In Burnley, 38% of children are now considered to be living in poverty. In Blackburn, 38% of people, and in Pendle, 38% of people are considered to be living in poverty. In the northeast, in the land of the Mackhams, 40% of children are living in poverty. And my friend Bishop Helen Ann, the new Bishop of Newcastle, 43% of children are living in poverty. We should be ashamed of that statistic. But last year at my opening address, I asked you to tell your stories, to tell your parables. And by good fortune, I published a book before Christmas talking about the cost of living crisis and people living in poverty. So I want to quickly tell you about some of their stories, like Judy, who has not had a boiler working in her rented accommodation since Christmas. For a lady who's waiting 14 weeks for mental health support, and without the desire and love of the church to step in, where would she be? For a lady who has a single mother who has an autistic child, who needs a specialised pram, has been waiting 6 months for that piece of equipment. And I want to quickly say thank you to churches that step up and step out and speak out and tell your parables. But those who are far more powerful than I am, who can control the purse strings and the dosh that this church holds, is to relieve some of the burden on those parishes that stand up and stand out and speak out and remove even the prospect of a parish share. The poverty that brings to that particular parish is immense. I urge you to take away that burden and allow them to use any money they have to go to serve the community and to truly speak into Jesus' gospel. Thank you.
Thank you. I now wish to test the mind of Synod on whether item 37 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 37. Please, with a show of hands, if you're on Zoom, can you indicate with a green tick? Thank you. That is carried. Against? Those against? That is carried. Thank you. We now vote on item 37. Those in favour, please show. If you're on Zoom, please indicate with a green tick. Thank you. Those against? That is clearly carried. Thank you very much. I now call on Professor Helen King to speak to and move item 38, her amendment.
Helen King, Oxford 378. I would like to insert after commit ourselves the extra words as individuals. Why? Debates like this on national or international affairs run the risk of becoming a succession of stories about what various church communities are doing, and I think there are two problems here which my amendment is intended to address. The focus of the phrasing on worshipping communities suggests that this is the only place in which we as Christians are active in caring for others. But we don't exist only in these worshipping communities. We work with secular groups too, whether in our workplaces, with citizens' advice, voluntary organisations, political groups, or local government. We do all we can in far more contexts than the motion as present suggests. As individuals, far beyond our worshipping communities, we work for justice. Not just the sticking plaster work of donating to and running food banks, for instance, but in working to challenge the structural inequalities of our society, the underlying causes of poverty. And my amendment is intended to go further to make the point that people in need don't always ask for help. Even if they do, they may not go to the authorities or the structures, but may feel better talking to a person, to someone they know. There's a lot of talk about friendship at the moment as a result of LLF. And as friends, as individuals in networks, we can perceive a situation where someone is not aware of support that already exists. So I believe that as Christians, we all have a responsibility to be aware of the basics of the benefit system, of the schemes utility companies run to reduce payments for those on low incomes, and we should then be sharing that knowledge. I speak from experience here in an Oxfordshire market town. Not everyone has a computer. Not everyone can cope with long forms. Many are too proud to admit the difficulties they're in. It's friendship between individuals, sitting alongside them, that is the best way to be Jesus to them. I beg to move the amendment standing in my name.
Thank you. I now call on John Spence to respond.
Thank you, Chair, and as previously indicated, I'm very happy to accept this amendment. It does seem so important that we don't just assume this is all down to others, but that we recognise the responsibility that each of us has, and the opportunity each of us have to use our talents for the benefit of those around us. Happy to accept the amendment.
Thank you. As we are almost halfway through, if there's no one wishing to speak to this amendment, can we move straight to the vote? Those in favour? If you're on Zoom, please indicate with a tick. Thank you. Those against? That is clearly carried. Thank you, Synod. I now call on Mr. Peter Adams to speak to item 39 and also to move his amendment. You have up to 2 minutes.
Thank you. Peter Adams, St Albans 392. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, John, for the breadth of emotion and the breadth of the focus that you brought in your speech. I fully support the motion before us. I have to say I'm not quite sure of the way the impact of the previous amendment impacts my words, but you get the heart of it. The impact of the crisis we face is disproportionately impacting the poor. In Luton, the community I'm privileged to serve, where I'm extensively involved, demand on our food bank, for example, has surged 30% in the last 3 months. As churches, we're responding as so many of our faiths and others of no faith are. We're struggling to keep the food bank working, just like so many around the nation. This amendment was born out of a desire to say more. However, I've been mindful it's very easy to hijack a motion like this and make it so exhaustive in scope, a wish list that there's little we can do. But the motion, it seems to me, is not about that. It's about what we can do within our areas of immediate remit as individuals and as churches. I believe the amendment that I put forward is in line with the spirit of the motion. At one level, it's simple and formulaic. It does what we often do to ensure our statements consistently speak about the whole culture of the church, our dioceses, parishes and other worship communities, and our schools and chaplaincies. As such, it extends the scope of this important call to the wider CV realm, and especially where through our school communities, we touch the lives of many young people and their families. It's within our reach. But we need to do more than that reach. The scale of the needs we now face goes beyond the capacity of charity, I suggest. We now seek wage justice for many. For 6 years, I chaired the governing body of a church school in Luton, where around half of our families are on free school meals. With more eligible, many of our staff, TAs, kitchen staff, etc., were from the local community. I was always saddened when they had children claiming free school meals, or when family workers told me the number of people, staff, being referred to the food bank. We paid a real living wage, but we're very conscious that didn't go far enough. Thank you.
I call on John Spence to respond.
I again accept the amendment, Chair.
I see no one standing to... Jack Shepherd. You have up to 2 minutes.
I strongly welcome this amendment because it emphasises the sense that this is something that we are sharing. The original motion talks about our parishes, our diocese, whereas we are learning not merely to exercise charity, but to stand together in solidarity. In a survey that I carried out in the parish of Skelmersdale, 93% of people said that they were struggling to pay for food for themselves and their family, and that they were aware of people worrying about staying warm this winter. In St Andrew's Community Network, which works with 11 food banks and 11 pantries in the northeast of Liverpool, it has been found that the use of food banks has increased 3 times since October. I have found, through opening a warm space in autumn, that the primary outcome has not been to meet people's physical needs, but to provide friendship and community, providing a pathway for people into the church. A key part of why I want to support this amendment. I would say church groups are amongst our nation's biggest providers of emergency food, warm spaces and debt and budgeting support. Yet it is so important that we do not do it in isolation. Through Together Liverpool's networks of kindness, we've seen the beginnings of working together. And I believe that by developing a coherent strategy in every diocese and across the Church of England as a whole to work together to support the most vulnerable in society, I am hopeful that we can more authentically become a visible Christian presence in every community.
Thank you. I now wish to test the mind of Synod on whether item 39 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 39. Those in favour, please show. If you're on Zoom, please show with your green tick. Thank you. Those against? That is clearly carried. We now move to vote on item 39. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. And those against? Item 39 is clearly carried. Can I ask Mr. Robin Lunn simply to move item 40?
Robin Lunn, Worcester, 432. I move item 40.
Call on John Spence. please.
Thank you. Given Robin's earlier explanation as to the motives for this amendment, I'm happy to accept.
Item 40 is now open, and I am sure we're going to allow it to... Oh, Mr. Scowen, you have up to 2 minutes.
I want to resist this amendment. The motion doesn't say that the war in Ukraine is to blame for everything. It doesn't even say that it is the only external factor. But the fact of the matter is that it is an enormous external factor in the crisis we have. It led very directly to a much higher rise in the cost of fuel, and especially gas, and in the case of gas, one that has been sustained, than would otherwise have happened. And it's the fuel cost rise which has had such a powerful knock-on effect on the cost of fertilizers, of food, and so many other things. It seems to me entirely appropriate to reflect the fact that although there is no doubt a whole range of different matters which have caused this problem, that this one, which was wholly beyond the control of anyone in this country, has played an enormous part in it. And I simply do not think that it is sensible to remove from consideration something that has been so powerful. Now, if we were trying to say, oh, well, it's all Putin's fault and nothing to do with anyone here, well, I would understand the point, but that is not what the motion says. No doubt the decision of the Truss government to pursue certain policies had an effect, but it's really very small by comparison with the effect of the war in Ukraine. So let's just be sensible and realistic about what has actually contributed to this. And where there is one thing that is so significant, let's name it. Thank you, Chair.
I see no one standing, so we will move straight. Lady there. You have up to 2 minutes.
Susan Lucas, Chelmsford, 82. I wish to speak in support of the amendment. In spite of what my friend Mr. Scowen has said, undoubtedly the war in Ukraine has had a significant effect. However, that would not be the case were it not for an underlying economic settlement which has actually been the default for the last 40 years. And in fact, there is a standing temptation to use the awful truth of the war in Ukraine and the awful effect that it has had as something of a fig leaf. I don't mean by anybody in this chamber, but by those who control the levers of power. By actually putting that in its place, that actually risks us actually condoning that use of the fig leaf. I would urge Synod to support the amendment. Thank you.
As no one is standing, I would like to move straight to a vote. Those in favour of the amendment, please show. If you are on Zoom, please indicate with a green tick. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. I would now like to call on Mr. Luke Appleton to speak to and move his amendment. You have up to 2 minutes.
Luke Appleton, Exeter 309. I would imagine everybody, like me in the chamber, would welcome Canon Spencer's motion in principle. Clearly, the Church has been a central pillar of the national response to the cost of living crisis. Much like the pandemic, it has shown the strengths and immeasurable benefits of the parish system and our church communities up and down the country. It is commendable that we are focused on helping our community and an important part of our call to love our neighbour. We must, however, also be people who practice what we preach. Part C of this motion calls upon His Majesty's government to take action and be generous towards our communities, rightly so. But are we as a national church, or even at a diocesan level, doing enough to support our parishes that are struggling? I've been contacted by a number of small rural parishes who are deeply distressed. Their feeling is that demographically, not the church itself, but the demographic it's in, the community is too affluent or not diverse enough to get some of the existing packages. I emphasise this is how they feel. I'm not saying this is reality. This is their feelings. They cannot pay the bills, that is reality, and the response, several of them, they say, has been, they've just been told to pray about it. But do we forget James's call for our faith to be evidenced by works? Or Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisee who bind up burdens but do not lift a finger to help? I'm sure we don't. Well, I'm not being dramatic, because this is just me expressing how these people feel. They've given so much to the church, so much of their money, of their time, of their hearts, and I'm sure we will agree that we can't turn our back on them in their hour of need. So my amendment is very simple. It recognises that there are many faithful, common fund-paying parishes crying out for help in deep distress. But this amendment isn't just about small parishes, it's about all our wonderful churches, their staff, their clergy, the families associated with them. And it is Canon Spencer sending a message to all of them that your church, that their church rather, cares, and that the church is there to support them in their hour of need. So I move the motion to the Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Mr. John Spence to respond.
Well, Chair, as I rather kick myself for not spotting that in the first place, I'm very happy, Luke, to accept the amendment.
You have up to 2 minutes.
Stephen Hogg, Leeds 328. I want to support in particular the Part E of Mr Appleton's amendment. The work done by our clergy in making efforts to alleviate poverty comes at great personal cost. Many of our clergy are burnt out. Now add to that the fact that some clergy are themselves facing poverty. It is good that some funds have been made available from the Centre for Heating Costs, but more is needed. I declare an interest. I am a trustee of Clergy Support Trust. And in 2022, we gave help to 18% of Church of England clergy. Nearly 1 in 5 clergy got grants from us. £4.8 million in grants, £250,000 on energy bills alone, £800,000 support for cost of living. The massive increase in the grants being paid by Clergy Support Trust was not on school fees and luxuries. They were on repairs to cars, new washing machines, glasses, and otherwise affordable laptop. And the greatest concern of all, to cover basics like heating costs. I've often said to my fellow trustees, I wish we didn't exist, but we do. So I encourage us to do all we can to help with the cost of living, but let's get our own house in order, with the central and local church bodies responsible for remuneration, for maintaining pastorages and for pensions. Look at what more they could be doing. What more could we as a church be doing to support clergy in poverty? Clergy Support Trust has supported clergy for 350 plus years. It's a bit of a scandal that clergy are in poverty at all. Thank you.
After the gentleman there, I will be testing the mind of Synod for a closure on this item.
Thank you, Chair. Ian Boothroyd, Southwell and Nottingham 422. I'd like to support Mr Appleton's amendment, and in particular to encourage the Archbishop's Council and our dioceses to keep under constant review the gap which has developed between stipends and recent inflation rates, and consider whether that gap can be closed more quickly. Yes, budgeting is difficult for dioceses, but I believe the cost of closing that gap is very small compared to the total resources of the Church of England spread across all its constituent bodies. And budgeting is hard also for families and individuals. And it seems to me to be questionable, at least, if under financial pressure the uprating of stipends becomes one of the balancing factors in our budgets. Perhaps it should be a higher priority than that. We have dedicated people called by God to lead the proclamation of the good news across the country. That in itself is good news. It's a pity if the bad news is that we can't sustain the real value of their income whilst they carry out that blessed work. Thank you, Chair.
I now invite us to vote on the amendment. And I wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 41 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 41. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. I now put item 41 to the vote. We will do this with a show of hands. If you're on Zoom, please indicate with a green tick. Those in favour of item 41, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. We now go back to the main motion as amended by items 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41. This is now open for debate, and I am going to call Angela Hanafin for a maiden speech, followed by Bishop Anne Hollinghurst. You have up to 2 minutes.
Angela Hanafin, Leeds 135. Thank you for calling me to speak. I wasn't planning to give my maiden speech on this debate. However, yesterday morning I received an email from my energy provider informing me that our direct debit was not sufficient to cover our usage and would be increased to £430. As you can imagine, I was concerned and temporarily distracted from the business of Synod, although I forwarded it to my husband to ask him to look into it urgently. And if this has happened to you, then you have my sympathies. We're not yet on Skid Row, and we'll work out how best to challenge the energy companies, but this little anecdote made me reflect on the importance of this debate. There are many people who are feeling the financial squeeze in various ways. Christmas is over, but the cost of it may not yet be paid for. Money worries bring increased stress, physical and mental health issues, which in turn impact the NHS. The cost of living crisis is the issue facing many homes in our country and many of our parishioners. The Church is called to speak up for those who can't defend themselves, to be a political actor, a partner, and a vital component in every local community. And our Gospel reading last Sunday reminded us that we are salt and light, elements which have impact to those around and which, if not used, are useless. So therefore, I would like to encourage Synod to vote for this motion. This issue is not going away, and we need to act now. Thank you.
The Bishop of Birmingham, followed by Rosie Austin.
Anne Hollinghurst, Bishop of Aston, but Birmingham, and thrilled to be the new female 007, by the way. Last autumn, the leader of Birmingham City Council declared a local state of emergency in relation to the cost of living crisis. He was clear that the enormity of the challenge required a pandemic level of response, and was also clear that an important strand of that response was the need to work with third sector partners, amongst which our own Thrive Together Birmingham is seen as key. This is the charity formed by our community regeneration team and has earned real credibility. And I'm immensely proud of the dedicated work of my colleagues who've taken a lead in the Birmingham response. In brief, Thrive has two current priorities: food poverty, supporting many churches in their hosting of food banks and pantries as a regional partner of church action on poverty, and the Warm Welcome initiative, which builds in Birmingham on our original Places of Welcome model, now adopted nationally in partnership with the Together Network and the Church Urban Fund. Thrive persuaded the City Council away from the initial idea of warm banks, advocating an approach which put the dignity of the individual at its heart, in line with the Poverty Truth Commission work that Thrive has been hosting with participation from senior leaders, councillors and local politicians. Essentially, Thrive exemplifies work in the three arenas outlined in the briefing paper: the church as partner, the church in the local community, and the church as political actor. One of Thrive's favourite quotes, as popularised by Desmond Tutu, is, "There comes a point when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream. We need to ask of, and along with, those in government, why, yes, beyond the Ukraine factor, they're falling in."
Rosie Austin, followed by the Archbishop of York.
Rosie
2 minutes.
Austin, 116 Exeter. This is my maiden speech. Thank you, Chair. So thank you, Synod, for taking precious time today to talk about this. The privilege of our deep connection with our communities means that the Church plays an important role in highlighting the needs we see, meeting needs wherever possible, and partnering with community organisations. But I want to briefly highlight the particular challenges being faced by isolated rural communities. Poverty in these communities is often described as hidden. People are resilient and have to be, turning to family and friends first, but this resilience is being sorely tested. Some examples of what looks different in rural communities. The report mentions food banks requested as much or more for people in low-paid seasonal work than out of it. For those villages fortunate enough to have a bus service, the food bank is 2 bus rides away and only open during working hours. So churches have set up small-scale pantries or found volunteers for a 15-mile-plus round trip. Warm spaces are great, but only when there's a community building still standing. Often that's the church, but without heating or toilets to offer. The energy cap helps, but there's not been any help yet to fill up oil tanks. Some people haven't been able to fill up since last summer, with oil prices doubling in a year. And before you mention net zero, these are rented properties. Speaking of which, many have been made homeless because of Airbnb and holiday rentals. And care, as community worker myself, not paid for petrol or travel time in the past, that's still true. So please remember the rural. Thank you. Thank you.
The Archbishop of York, followed by Nikki Pennington for a maiden speech.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to follow Rosie Austin. It's so important to hear about rural poverty, which is often so neglected. So last year at Bishopthorpe, we had a symposium on the cost of living crisis and various issues of poverty, with lots of people active in this area coming to see us. This was the overwhelming conclusion that the cost of living crisis, as we call it, is best understood as a spike on top of a long-term trend. And it's important to understand the long-term trend of poverty in this nation. Secondly, that what was needed from the church was a narrative of hope that would reset the whole way that we approach this. And because I'm not very politically savvy, if I'd read my papers in time, I would have offered an amendment. Continue to pray, yes. Commit ourselves, yes. Offer generous support, yes. Commend steps, yes, yes, yes. I agree with all of this, but there's something missing, which is the prophetic voice of the church to say, this is not how it's meant to be. And then to offer a coherent narrative of hope of what it could be, which is ironically what we're very good at and also what we have been doing. I mean, look at the work of the Housing Commission, look at 2 weeks ago the launch of the Reimagining Care Commission, the idea of a national care covenant. These are things that will reset the compass of our nation. I mean, let me just give you one example. Sadly, there's so many hundreds we could reach for, but just this week, the British Dental Association told us that 83% of teachers in secondary schools report the fact that they are handing out toothpaste and toothbrushes to students. That's how bad it's got. That's how far away we have come as a nation from the world I grew up in, where you could get dental treatment for free. Now, if you want a toothbrush, you need to ask your teacher. I mean, it is just appalling. I went to a school in Middlesbrough last year. Whereas I used to send my kids to school with a lunchbox with their lunch in it, these kids go to school with an empty lunchbox because there's a food bank in the school. So we need not just to do all these things, of course I support them, but there is something missing which we are doing and we should be proud of, which is offering a narrative of hope.
After Nikki Pennington, I'm afraid I will be testing the mind of Synod for closure on this motion. 2 minutes, Nikki.
Nikki Pennington, Carlisle Diocese 079. I serve 4 parishes on the west coast of Cumbria, and like many clergy across this country, I am seeing the impact, the life-threatening and life-limiting impact that the figures we're talking about here today are having on people's lives. And this is not overstating the case. I cannot be the only clergy person ministering in areas of economic need, experiencing a significantly higher number of funerals this winter. The report calls upon the Church to pray to continue to advocate on behalf of those most in need and vulnerable to the crippling cost of living, to seek to engage with the needs of those in their local communities, working collaboratively with other agencies, offering what resources we have at our disposal to ease the measure of the burden of the impact of the cost of living on people's lives. In a few months' time as a church, we'll be engaging in a period of prayer and evangelism, known to many as Thy Kingdom Come. This is surely an opportunity for faith communities across the country to witness to the kind of kingdom the Scriptures encourage us all to work for and advocate. A kingdom in which justice and mercy flow down. A kingdom where the needs of the most vulnerable are placed at the centre and given priority. A kingdom where all are welcomed, valued and included. As we look at the life of Jesus and the mandate we're given through Scriptures, it's clear that as Christ's followers, we're called to do justice. And so, alongside all the many ways in which faith communities are seeking to meet the needs of those in desperate need, I invite communities up and down the country to use this period of prayer and evangelism as a time for practical action to counter the day-to-day cost of living crisis. Why not go to the streets? Why not take part in walks of witness and solidarity, raising our voices, standing out, speaking out on behalf of those who are most in need in our parishes?
I now wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 10 as amended has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 10 as amended. Those in favour, please show. If you're on Zoom, please indicate with a green tick. Thank you. Those against? This is clearly carried. Thank you. I now call on John Spence to respond to the debate. Thank you. You have up to 3 minutes.
Well, Chair, thank you, and I thank all those who moved amendments, only one of which received resistance. Clive, I absolutely get the importance of Ukraine. I just accepted the amendment so that we could focus on the main discussion. Stephen and Ian, please be assured that we do not see stipends as a balancing measure. I'm grateful to Alex and Angela, who gave examples of what it's like in real time. Angela, from a very personal, painful perspective. Bishop Anne, you could be my special agent of Birmingham anytime, and by golly, what a city that it is for demonstrating the power of working together. Nikki and Rosie reminding us of the universality of need and the depth of it. So I'm grateful to all those speakers. Kate and Jack both gave us the Liverpool perspective. And Stephen, Archbishop, I really don't know what you do with your time all the time. You really must get more up to date so that you can move these amendments in good time. But I share with you, of course, we have to have a narrative of hope. And I suggest to you that we are the living epitome of it. The whole point about the amendment from Helen, that this is up to us individually. We can write narratives. Yes, we can be advocates. But it is the living example of what we do that creates the epitome, the narrative of hope from which others are inspired. And Kate and Jack, I say to you, Liverpool, your parish, your families, your community, your city may be very short of money, but they have you. They have the wonderful spirit that you show. They have a strong diocesan team under a brilliant chief executive, and they have Bishop John. And I invite you to show us the narrative of hope that is Liverpool, the Church of England. Thank you.
Point of order.
John Wilson, Lichfield 341. Chair, given the importance of this item, and in particular under paragraph C, where we're calling for action by those who meet in another place, it would be good to have an accurate count of the Synod. Would you order a count of the Synod, please?
That has my approval. Thank you. So do I need to read all those? Yeah. So this is. This is a counted vote of the Synod, the whole Synod, on item 10 as amended. Those present at Church House using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2, and those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
The results of the vote, those voting in favour, 301, against, nil, recorded abstentions, nil. This concludes the item of business. Thank you.
Good morning, Synod. We are now going back to the draft Church of England miscellaneous provisions measure, which had to be adjourned. The debate had to be adjourned yesterday, as you will remember. Item 523 we had got to, that clause 2, stand part of the measure, was carried. You're going to need order paper 2 for this, not the order paper 4 that we've had for this morning. Order paper 2 and GS 227A. So after we had done item 523, Mr. Scowen then moved, pursuant to Standing Order 60, that the measure be considered for further revision in committee. The effect of that motion, if carried, would be that the entire measure was returned to the revision committee for further revision. Members would then have the opportunity to send further proposals to the revision committee for its consideration. However, I now understand that Mr. Scowen wishes to withdraw his motion on the understanding that the steering committee will withdraw clause 8, the clause Mr. Scowen and some other members who spoke in the debate on the report of the revision committee were concerned about. A motion once moved may be withdrawn only with the leave of the Synod. I therefore call Mr. Scowen to speak for up to 2 minutes, Clive. You're over there this time.
Don't think I shall need that, Chair. Yes, I can confirm that your understanding is correct. I'm extremely grateful to Stephen Hoffmeyer and the members of the steering committee who have considered this matter and seen that actually there was a bigger issue behind clause 8 than first appears, and that does need to be properly considered. My understanding is that the group that is currently working on the revision to the mission and pastoral measure will be asked to consider not only clause 8 but the other matters related to it, and that will give those who are particularly concerned about the protection of those running BMOs to have their say and to seek to influence the changes to the mission and pastoral measure. So I'm very grateful that what I've sought to achieve has been achieved, and I withdraw my motion.
Mr. Scowen has sought leave to withdraw his motion for recommittal of the measure to the revision committee. I assume that this is agreed. The motion for recommittal is withdrawn. In light of the indication from the steering committee about their intention to withdraw clause 8, item 524 becomes the motion that clauses 3 to 7 stand part of the measure. Now, given that that's a new item, does any member wish to speak against that motion? As no member has indicated an intention to speak against the motion that clause 3 to 7 stand part of the measure, that motion is deemed carried. I now call Mr. Stephen Hofmeyr to move that clause 8 be withdrawn. Stephen, you have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't use that, but just to reiterate what Clive has said, following very helpful discussions involving those who spoke on Clause 8 in the Take Note debate yesterday, and indeed, excuse me, other holders of BMO and Mr. Scowen, the agreement was reached that he would withdraw his request that the matter go for further revision, and in the circumstances, we are inviting you, please, to vote in favour of our motion that Clause 8 be withdrawn. The two reasons for that are, as Mr. Scowen said, the Mission and Pastoral Measure 2011 is currently under review generally, and amending proposals will be brought back to Synod in the near future. And Bishop's mission orders are being considered at part of that review, and the steering committee is of the view that the amendment proposed by Clause 8 would be better considered as part of a general review rather than being taken in a piecemeal manner at this stage. And secondly, as has been pointed out, if Clause 8 is not withdrawn, there is a risk that the whole measure will be delayed by more than 6 months, whilst Clause 8 is given further consideration. In the view of the steering committee, that would be unfortunate and disproportionate byproduct of a course which can be avoided in the way we have suggested, and the added benefit that the amendment proposed by Clause 8 can be considered in the context of a thorough review of the Mission and Pastoral Measure 2011 generally, and BMOs in particular. And so for these two reasons, we would invite you to support the motion that Clause 8 be withdrawn.
So the motion to withdraw Clause 8 has been moved, and there is an opportunity, if you desire, to speak to this. The Archbishop of York, you have up to 3 minutes, Archbishop.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I thought it's worth noting, because this is a slightly unusual thing for Synod to do, and just to make it very clear how grateful I am personally to, to Stephen Hofmeyr, to Clive Scowen and to others for coming up with what I think is an elegant and very helpful way forward. Synod will realise I have great sympathy with people who perhaps read their papers too late to enter into the legislative process in the way that we might. And so it was really helpful to hear from practitioners in BMOs yesterday morning. And so this seems to me to be a good example of Synod working at its best. And therefore we ought to note that. I thought the other thing that might be worth saying from the front here is sometimes the issue of trust comes up, which obviously distresses all of us because we want to be people of trust. And I thought it'd be also good to put on record that I don't for a moment think that there's any issue of trust here with bishops. It is about proper process for BMOs. I didn't hear that from any of the speakers yesterday. I'm in favour of approaching it in this way, and I think Synod also needs to bear in mind the things that Luke Miller was saying yesterday about the role of the visitor. So I'm sure we can sort this out. I'm very grateful that we found this way of sorting it out, and I just thought it might be helpful for Synod to hear from here, as it were, thanks and support for this way forward.
The prolocutor.
Luke Miller, 163 London. Very quickly, just to say that this also gives an opportunity to look into one of the things that needs smoothing around about BMOs. They're such an important part of our ecology. They are so successful in so many ways. We have had to struggle with things like the synodical representation I've mentioned before about how difficult it is to start a parish without having a BMO, because we need to have some sort of structure before you can construct all the synodical bits. The PCC has to rest on an electoral roll. Where do you get an electoral roll from? And therefore, when we started the parish, I had to chair a BMO CIO. There's all of that. So there's an opportunity here to make BMOs even better. And I hope we can note that that will be the outcome of this, rather than any kind of diminution of their role amongst us.
Thank you. I now put this item to Synod, that the Clause 8 be withdrawn from the measure. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? That is clearly carried. We come to the motion which I suggest be numbered 524A, that Clause 9 stand part of the measure. As no member has indicated an intention to speak against the motion, item 524A is deemed carried. We therefore come to Clause 10. I invite Mr. Geoffrey Tattersall, KC, to move his amendment at item 525. Geoffrey, you have up to 5 minutes.
Geoffrey Tattersall, Manchester 365, and now for something entirely different. I have to declare an interest. In a previous life, I was a barrister, and for many years I was the Chancellor of the Diocese of Manchester and Carlisle and the Vicar General of Soda and Man. And contrary to what was said originally in Notice Paper 8, this modest amendment does not simply seek to retain a retirement age of 70 for chancellors when the retirement age for secular judges has recently risen to 75. And that is because for many years the default retirement age for chancellors has been 70, but it was expressly provided that if a chancellor wished to remain in office beyond the age of 70, a diocesan bishop has to consider, after consultation with the Dean of the Arches, whether it is in the best interests of the diocese that he or she should continue to serve in office beyond the age of 70, initially until 72, and then annually until the age of 75. And so it was that many chancellors, like me, remained in office until the age of 75. I know you can't believe I'm so old, but I just wear well, so the wife says. So it must be true. Of course, some do tend to elect to retire when they're 70, and of course, chancellors can retire at any age. The current provisions have been enforced for very many years and have worked well, and it is not suggested that they have ever been abused by a diocesan bishop. What is proposed now in this draft measure is that a chancellor will have a right, I stress the word right, to remain in office until the age of 75, irrespective of whether or not that is in the interest of the diocese or whatever the views of the diocesan bishop may be. I do not believe that this is appropriate. At the Revision Committee, I proposed the retention of the existing legal position, and this was rejected by the Revision Committee on the grounds of consistency with the terms of service for secular judges, and that was so important, and that there was no rational basis for distinguishing chancellors from secular judges. But there is no need for such consistency, and I give two examples. Secular judges are often appointed in their 50s and want to work beyond the age of 70 to obtain their full pension, which is only earned after 20 years' service. By contrast, chancellors receive no pension, and I should add, quickly, that it's not suggested that they should. Secondly, secular judges are employed with detailed conditions of service and may be removed from office for good reason by the Lord Chancellor. By contrast, chancellors have no terms of service, and the only basis for their removal from office is pursuant to Section 3.3 of the Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction and Care of Churches Measure 2018, and that is if the upper house of the convocation, the appropriate convocation, resolves that the Chancellor is incapable of acting or unfit for office. I'm not aware that this provision has ever been used, and certainly it could not be used, one would think, to deal with a Chancellor who simply took too long to make decisions, or one who, for whatever reason, had lost the confidence of the diocesan bishop and/or the diocese. I know that if this debate is allowed to proceed, which I hope that it will, notwithstanding time constraints, the Vicar-General of York would like to address an additional point of the unintended consequence as to the adverse effect on diversity of what is proposed in the measure, on the basis that most of the Chancellors are unhappily white men. I beg to move the amendment standing in my name at 525.
Mr Tattersall has moved his amendment. I therefore call Mr Hoffmeyer to speak for not more than 5 minutes in reply.
Thank you, Chair. First, I declare an interest as a Deputy High Court Judge and Recorder, but not an ecclesiastical judge. The Revision Committee, of which the Steering Committee forms a part, unanimously rejected the amendment at the revision stage and continue to do so for two reasons. In the public square, as you've heard, the judicial retirement age has been put back to 75. It was 75 for many, many, many years. About 20 years ago, it was reduced to 72 and then to 70. This was found to have been a mistake. The decision has been reversed and the historic position has recently been restored. The Revision Committee considers that the reasons which caused the judicial retirement age to be restored are sound and should apply equally to ecclesiastical judges, and that ecclesiastical judges should not be an exception. Second, insofar as the amendment is being driven by the fact that there is currently, I understand, a surfeit of ecclesiastical judges, this is not a good reason for the amendment. If this were a good reason, it would make it necessary for us to tinker with the provision on a regular basis, depending on the movements in supply and demand. Regular tinkering would not be practical and in principle would not be appropriate. For these reasons, I would encourage you to resist the amendment.
Mr Hoffmeyer has resisted the tinkering, and so the debate can only continue if I see 25 or more members standing or indicating or using a green tick that they want the debate to take place. There are more than 25 members. The debate is now then open. Peter Collier, Father Benfield, you have, start with 5 minutes.
Peter Collier, 456 Vicar General York. Thank you for calling me. I also declare an interest. I'm currently the Chancellor of York for another 19 days. Then I will be replaced. I've been subject of extensions and I'm currently 74. Those extensions were, I didn't really want them to go on for quite so long. There were good reasons on each occasion. Usually the unintended consequences of legislation reveal themselves only after it's been enacted and in operation for a while. Sometimes it's possible to spot the unintended consequences, and rather late in the day, I think I've identified a significant one in relation to this provision. Not for the reasons put forward by Geoffrey Tattersall when he addressed the Revision Committee, and they haven't considered this At least they haven't heard my argument at any length, and it's not going to be particularly long. But knowing as I do the identity of all current chancellors, and courtesy of who's who, their dates of birth and ages, I can tell you that there are 10 chancellors between the ages of 65 and 69. If, as I think is likely, they all took advantage of the new proposed retirement age, it would mean that there would be no new chancellors appointed, deaths apart, until 2029. It won't surprise you to know that those chancellors are all, as Geoffrey has already said, elderly white males. And the Dean of Arches has previously told Synod of her ambition to bring diversity to the ecclesiastical judiciary, and she is being quite successful in that, in recruiting people as deputies. But bringing in this extended age limit will have a significant torpedo effect on those ambitions because of the consequence I've just stated, 2029 being the first date when we will have new chancellors. Whatever else they tell you, the real reason the secular judiciary have moved their age back to 75 is because of very serious recruitment problems. I was speaking to a very senior judge only last night who was telling me exactly that. That's the real reason for this, in addition to some problems they had with pension proposals. But we don't have any such problems. The issue of perceived bias is unreal in our world. The court is the bishop's court. It's often been said the chancellor is the alter ego of the bishop. I was the alter ego, therefore, of the previous Archbishop of York, and I'm now adjusting to being the alter ego of the present Archbishop of York. Of course, if the bishop himself were a party, or as in the Rustat case, Jesus College, Cambridge, a witness, then as happened there, the chancellor would ask someone to step in as a deputy. I can't see any circumstances where chancellors might be tempted, or even be thought to be tempted, to decide contested matters so as to curry favour with the bishop in order to earn an extension, which is one of the reasons it's not been referred to, but has been stated as a need for this to happen. The risk of obstructing future diversity is a much greater problem, and a real one which Synod can address by rejecting this proposal. Thank you.
Father Benfield, and then Sir after.
Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. I know that the Chancellor of Blackburn, His Honour Judge David Hodge QC, is concerned about this amendment. The Rustat case has been mentioned. He was the judge in that case, sitting as a deputy in the Diocese of Ely. He is concerned that had it been in the Blackburn Consistory Court and the bishop did not like the result, he would be put in a difficult position in seeking to have his term of office extended. It is a fundamental principle that judges should be independent, and I think we're in danger here of judges looking over their shoulder. Will my diocesan bishop like this? Will he agree to the extension of my term of office? So I oppose this amendment.
Thank you, gentlemen, and then the Dean of Arches.
Thank you, Chair, Synod members. I stand to ask you to accept Clause 10 in all its fullness and to reject...
Name and number, please.
Apologies. Gavin Drake, 421 Sutherland, Nottingham. I ask you to accept Clause 10 in all its fullness and reject Mr Tattersalls' request to leave out subsection 3. I was a member of the revision committee on this measure, and it was a pleasure to serve under Archdeacon Nicky Gork. Revision committees have a completely different feel to debates in the Synod chamber. There's much more listening and discussion to understand each other's position and find common ground, and I recommend the opportunity to serve in this way to all Synod members, and I pray that we can apply that sense of working together to other aspects of Synod business. But to the matter in hand, all subsection 3 does is to align the retirement age of a certain class of ecclesiastical judges, diocesan chancellors, with that of judges in the secular sphere. Are there bad ecclesiastical judges? Possibly. I won't say yes, because they understand defamation law better than I do. Are there bad judicial decisions? Possibly. But this section of the miscellaneous provision measure does not address how to deal with per judges, per judicial decisions, the timings of judgment, capability or diversity. It merely raises the retirement age to 75 in line with practice in the secular courts. If there are poor judges making poor judicial decisions, a lack of diversity, an absence of terms of service, then let us introduce legislation and procedures to deal with those. A poor ecclesiastical judge aged 45 is as bad as a poor ecclesiastical judge aged 69. Waiting until a poor ecclesiastical judge is required to retire, whether at 70 or 75, is not the answer to the problems Mr Tattersall and the Vicar General of York raise. But they do raise important points about poor ecclesiastical judges and the system of appointment and terms of service, and I would be delighted if we as a Synod could address this, not just in the case of diocesan chancellors and commissaries, but also with proper challenge and appeal processes for judges appointed under the clergy discipline measure. But the solution sought by Mr Tattersall of not letting them serve an additional 5 years automatically is not the way to do it. This subsection is not about poor ecclesiastical judges or diversity. The Synod can deal with that, but that isn't what this clause is trying to do. So I ask the Synod to retain subsection 3 as part of clause 10 and to accept it as part of the measure. Thank you.
Thank you. The Dean of Arches.
Thank you very much. Morag Ellis 454. I do not intend to speak one way or the other on this motion. I merely wish to clarify one point. The reason why I don't wish to speak one way or the other is because I do feel somewhat conflicted. I am 60 years of age, and the legislation allows me to continue until I'm 75. So you're stuck with me for a long time, the Lord willing. The point which I just wanted to make in clarification responds to something that Stephen Hofmeyr said. He suggested that there might be a surfeit of ecclesiastical judges, too many of them. Well, some of you might think that there are too many lawyers on the earth, full stop. But I wish to reassure Synod that we don't have a surfeit of judges. There are 1 or 2 vacancies for deputies, which are under active consideration. We don't have a surfeit. I think we have quite a good number of judges, and that is the only thing which I wish to say. Thank you very much for calling me.
Thank you very much. I see no one standing, so I call on Geoffrey Tattersall to respond to the debate, and you have up to 3 minutes, Geoffrey.
Well, you would think that I would be in favour of giving a right to the Chancellor to sit for longer. That would have enabled me to sit for longer without having to ask my diocesan bishop. But I think as a matter of principle, it's the wrong thing. Please listen carefully to what Stephen Hofmeyr said about the need for consistency, because it's not really giving any reason at all. It's comparing secular judges and ecclesiastical judges is like comparing apples and pears. They're not the same thing. Peter Collier made a point about why the judges' retirement age has risen. If you read the Times yesterday, you will discover that the Lord Chancellor was interviewed by, I think, Joshua Rosenberg about the number of judges, and he said that there were 16 unfilled circuit judge appointments which they had not been able to fill through competition. And therefore they'd appointed 30 district judges to sit with juries to try and clear the backlog. And that's why the judicial age limit is being raised, apart from the fact they're appointing people later and they need to get a pension. So I don't want to repeat myself. The arguments are that the system works very well at the moment, as it is, and there is no need to tinker with it.
Thank you. I therefore put item 525 to the vote. That this is, as you'll see, on order paper 2 to leave out subsection 3 of clause 10. All those in favour of the amendment, please show. Thank you. All those against? That is carried. We come to item 526, that clause 10, as amended, stand part of the measure. As no member has indicated the wish to speak against it, item 526 is deemed to be carried. We come to item 527, the stand part motion for clauses 11 to 13. As no member has indicated an intention to speak against the motion, item 527 is deemed carried. We move to clause 14. I invite the Reverend Paul Benfield to move his amendment at item 528. Paul, you may speak for up to 5 minutes.
Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. As the law stands at present, anyone who is carrying out functions of care and conservation of churches must have due regard to the role of a church as a centre of worship and mission. As clause 14 is drafted at the moment, it adds to that the duty to have due regard to environmental protection. I have no problem with considering environmental protection, but I am concerned as to whether environmental protection considerations might trump the duty to have regard to the role of a church as a centre of worship and mission. As the explanatory memorandum helpfully states, this amendment would provide that if there were to be a conflict between the new duty on environmental matters and the existing duty on worship and mission, then the latter is to have priority. The Revision Committee report points out that the 5 marks of mission include environmental protection. This is true, but the 5 marks of mission also include responding to human need by loving service, yet that is not mentioned in this new clause. Leaving environmental protection with an equal status to worship and mission might suggest that this is more important than using churches for community service. My amendment makes clear that worship and mission are the primary duty, but that environmental and other matters are subsidiary if there is a conflict. I beg to move the amendment standing in my name.
Thank you. I call the Venerable Douglas Detmer, a member of the Steering Committee, to respond and to speak for not more than 5 minutes in reply.
Detmer, Exeter 117. The Steering Committee wishes to resist this amendment and would encourage you to vote against it. I'd like to start by referring to Father Benfield's comments yesterday to say that I and the committee very much hear what he said about the different dynamics of revision committees online and in person. That said, we want to assure Father Benfield that his points were received and understood. However, as Father Benfield has already said, Section 35 of the Care of Churches measure already requires anyone carrying out functions of care and conservation under the measure to have due regard to the role of a church as a local centre of worship and mission. The additional wording, obviously, seeks to strengthen the arm of those who are exercising responsibilities in the care of churches for meeting the Church of England's net carbon zero goals. What we need to remember, of course, as Father Benfield has already said, is that worship and mission on the one hand and environmental protection on the other are not two different things. Environmental protection, along with evangelism and discipleship formation and loving service of our communities and striving for social justice, are the marks of mission. Environmental protection is one of those. And the constant business of PCCs and incumbents and DACs and chancellors in making decisions about how best to care for and conserve churches is to balance all those factors, worship and mission. To artificially constrain the ability of PCCs and incumbents and DACs and chancellors in coming to an appropriate balance of those considerations by saying that one area of mission is to trump all the rest, or even that worship and 4 areas of mission are to trump 1 is unduly to predetermine decisions which are properly made by those who know their own local contexts and their church buildings best. So I'd ask you, Synod, to resist this amendment.
Given that the steering committee resists this amendment, for the debate to continue, I have to see 25 members or more standing, indicating or using the green tick. There are more than 25. Therefore, this item is open for debate. Thank you. And at the back, you have up to 5 minutes initially.
Ruth Newton, 137, Vice Chair of the General Synod Environment Group, member of the Environmental Working Group. Thank you, Chair. I wish to oppose this amendment because it suggests that environmental protection runs contrary to the purpose of a church, that is, worship and mission. But as has been established, environmental protection is part of the church's mission, the 5th mark, but also in a time not only of climate change, but of a biodiversity crisis, both of which are and will impact on human flourishing in this country and globally, then environmental protection falls within marks 3 and 4, to respond to human need by loving service and to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation. Whilst I fully accept that there are occasions when the local church must choose between competing goods in its expression of mission, for example, when a church that has not yet dispensed with its oil boiler is seeking to be a warm space, then it must choose between its missional priorities. And I am not advocating that environmental puritanism, which sees net zero as the trump card, and neither, I would suggest, is this motion. But I would like to see it, indeed it would be a relief to see it, together with the accessibility considerations that are also in the motion, trump built heritage occasionally and be considered more regularly. I would like to see it in terms of environment proofing rather than pursuing a solely environmental mission. And I cannot conceive of an occasion where environmental protection is not mission. I would also like to remind Synod that all creation worships God and that his glory is shown through it. So it is not only humans who have a role in worshipping God. Rather than being a distraction from worship, environmental protection enhances the worship that all creation, humans included, can offer to God. Additionally, I would like to address the misapprehension which I have heard but which hasn't been raised in this debate, that attentiveness to environmental protection is a novel innovation in mission and that the Church, in adopting it, is following the world's agenda. I am proud that in 1941, following the Malvern Conference, members of the Church of England, including Archbishop William Temple, issued what is believed to be the first high-level statement on the environment by a mainstream denomination. The Church of England was ahead of the game then, and I would like it to remain so. Environmental protection is mission. It is not the Cinderella of the marks of mission. We were ahead of the game, and I hope that we can remain so. I urge you to resist this amendment.
Prudence Daly.
Prudence Daly, 376 Oxford. I would like to support this amendment. It has been suggested that this amendment in some way removes or downplays the importance of environmental protection. But as has already been pointed out, environmental protection is included within worship and mission. And so effectively the way the proposal is currently worded, unamended, it puts environmental protection in there doubly. It's included in worship and mission, and then it comes as a separate function. And so by expressing it in that way, it elevates environmental protection amongst all the other elements of worship and mission, which I'm sure is not the intention. That if somebody were to say to you, say a visitor from Mars said, there's a church over there, what's it for? What does that church do? What's its function? Probably the first thing you wouldn't say is, well, it's there to look after environmental protection. The first thing you would say is, it's there for worship and mission. Now, yes, environmental protection is important, but this amendment does not seek to remove that. It just seeks to put it back into its proper context as one of the elements of worship and mission on a par with the others, which indeed still gets special mention. It doesn't even take out the special mention that environmental protection gets. It just seeks to make it clear that that doesn't trump all the other equally important aspects of worship and mission. So I would urge Synod please to support this amendment.
Thank you. The gentleman there, then Dean of Arches.
Luke Appleton, 309. I think I completely support the amendment. I think it's important for us to be sustainable to continue to exist, but we do not exist to be sustainable. I would urge us to seek first the kingdom of God, and then all else will be added to us. So I just want to say that I really, really support the amendment. Thank you.
The Dean of Arches.
Maura Gellis, 454. Thank you very much for calling me. I wish to speak against Father Benfield's proposed amendment for two reasons. One, it's unnecessary. Two, it's unhelpful. And at the same time, I want to persuade members of Synod that even legislation can be written in what the Archbishop of Canterbury has referred to as the language of Christian. And that, in the case of the proposed amendment to Section 35 of the 2018 measure, it is written in Christian. Some of you will remember the debate this time last year on the zero carbon amendments to the faculty jurisdiction rules. Those amendments were voted for by a large majority in the light of Synod's own resolution previously to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. The new rules introduced a requirement for a careful process to inform choices that parishes and others make about matters with implications for carbon neutrality. I spoke about the fifth mark of mission, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. The proposed amendment to the measure is in line with those changes to the rules, which are underpinned by the very practical zero carbon guidance of the Church Buildings Council. Father Benfield's amendment, with respect, presupposes a contest between mission and environmental responsibility, but there is in truth no contest because the legislation as drafted is drafted and written in Christian, requiring due regard both to the local role and to the wider environmental implications, recalling that care for the environment is an integral element of the mission of the Church. Father Benfield's amendment is therefore unnecessary. Secondly, it would also be unhelpful because potentially it would reduce the incentive to put every effort into exploring green options. As drafted, the proposed addition to the measure means that PCCs, DHCs, archdeacons, and others concerned with the care of churches will have due regard to both on a case-by-case basis to reach the best decisions in each case. There is no talk of trumping or anything like it in the explanatory note when one reads it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I see no one standing, so I call Father Benfield to respond to the debate, and you have up to 3 minutes, Paul.
Thank you. Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. Ruth Newton seeks to oppose my amendment because she says the amendment suggests that environmental protection runs contrary to the Church's mission. It does not do that. I think there's a misunderstanding there. I agree with Prudence Daly that she points out that this clause as it stands seems to put environmental protection into the equation twice. The first thing a church is there for is worship and mission, and that's why it should have priority. Going back to Ruth Newton's, if she cannot conceive of a situation where environmental protection is not mission, then surely clause 14 is not needed at all. Why are we mentioning it at all? We should vote clause 14 down. It's just extra words for the sake of it, because environmental protection is included in mission. I think you'll have to make your own mind up as regards the Dean of Arches' comments that my amendment is both unnecessary, unhelpful, but I would urge you that it is not, and I urge you to support this amendment.
Thank you. I therefore put item 5 to 8, the amendment to Synod. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. That is lost. We come to item 529, that clause 14 stand part of the measure. As no member has indicated the wish to speak against it, item 529 is deemed to be carried. We come to clause 15. I invite the Reverend Tom Walford to move his amendments. Now, Tom, I understand you'd quite like to speak to all of them. Is that right?
Yes, please, to items 530 to 534 inclusive.
I'm happy that you do that, but you still only get 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted with the... my name, Tom Walford, Blackburn 070. I'm delighted with the explanatory statements provided in the order paper because they confirm that my proposed amendments do exactly what I hoped they would. This is the Ron seal of miscellaneous provisions amendments. It does exactly what it says on the tin. The unamended measure in clause 15, subsections 1 and 2, simply confers the incumbent's powers concerning land to the bishop in case of vacancy. These amendments would give those powers instead to a priest in charge, or if there is none, still to the bishop, but only at the request of the PCC. Yes, full disclosure, my amendment is a save the parish type amendment, since it resists the flow of decision-making away from on the ground in the parish priests and parishioners to the Episcopal Diocesan Centre. But it is at the soft and cuddly end of save the parish style amendments. The hard save the parish play here would have been to strike out the whole of clauses 1 and 2, which I confess was my first gambit to the revision committee. That would have prevented the designation or sale of parish land indefinitely until the bishop licensed an incumbent. But the amendments I'm moving today are far more modest. They still allow for the bishop ultimately to exercise the rights of an incumbent over land in a vacancy, but they insert 2 little provisions that keep the initiative for decisions to be made about land more local for longer. The amended mechanism puts the PCC in the driving seat, but still confers the necessary power to the bishop. In practical terms, it means that if the designation or other disposal of land is a no-brainer, so it's needed for the parish, it's good for the mission of the church, it provides a common-sense solution to an anomalous situation, something like that, then what this clause of the measure intends to achieve will go smoothly and quickly ahead. But if it's controversial, if parishioners might strenuously object, If the overall effect of the designation or disposal of land on the Church's witness and mission is uncertain, well, then it's only appropriate that the initiative for proceeding belongs on the ground in the community directly affected, with the people in the parish. One might hope, of course, that in most cases there wouldn't be much difference between a bishop initiating a course of action and then involving the PCC in consultation and the faculty process on the one hand, and a PCC first resolving to ask the bishop to act on the other. So in both cases, one would expect local sensitivities and sentiments to feature prominently. But as one of our pastoral principles that pertains to today's second most controversial and high-profile debate after this one puts it, we need to pay attention to power. The power dynamic over church land between a PCC in vacancy and a bishop may be shared, but it's not symmetrical. It would be easy for a PCC to get the impression, erroneously I'm sure, that they were under pressure to accede to a bishop's scheme to designate or dispose of land. But if the initiative lies with the PCC in the first instance, that impression of pressure would be considerably less likely to occur. So please, Synod, vote for my ever so soft and cuddly Save the Parish style amendment to keep those on the ground in the community being directly affected in the driving seat concerning the designation or disposal of land in their parish. I think I formally have to beg to move the first amendment standing at 530, standing in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. I therefore call the Venerable Douglas Detmer to speak in response. You have up to 5 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Chair Detmer. Exeter 117. I'm delighted to get to respond to a soft and cuddly amendment. I don't know what the opposite would look like. Thank you to Mr. Woodford for the great thoughtfulness that has gone into the framing of this amendment. However, the steering committee does wish to resist it and asks the Synod to do so. Sometimes legislation or proposed amendments might seem to be addressing a great point of principle. I think that's what Mr. Woodford had in mind when he said that just now this relates to the incumbent's powers concerning land being taken over by the bishop during a vacancy. In fact, this is a minor, technical, utterly boring change to the legislation, the church property measure, which is simply part of the ironing out of an inconsistency, the filling in of a lacuna. Everywhere else in the church property measure, during a vacancy, the incumbent's powers relating to benefice land revert to the bishop. So during a vacancy, the bishop is empowered already to sell the parsonage house or divide it or to sell part of its garden, to grant a covenant in relation to benefice property, to grant an easement over benefice land, and to do things relating to churches and churchyards, which even so require the bishop to obtain a faculty from his or her own consistory court. All those things are already in the province of the diocesan bishop during a vacancy. For some reason, the church property measure left out and therefore created a problem when things need to happen in this area, what to do during a vacancy when what needs to happen is the granting of permission for a highway, public road, right-of-way to run across benefice land. This simply fills in that lacuna. There are a couple of problems, though, with this amendment, whatever you think about the principle of making such a meal out of such a small technical matter in a miscellaneous provisions measure. And the first is this, that the amendment refers to the PCC having certain powers particularly the power to ask the bishop to do something. Now, the PCC is fine where we're talking about a one parish benefice. For those of us who serve in rural areas, we know that sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 ecclesiastical parishes are within the area of a benefice. Which is the PCC we're talking about? Is it the PCC of the parish within the boundaries of which the parsonage house is? Well, in a multi-parish benefice, every PCC is an interested party in anything to do with the parsonage house of that benefice. It's their parson and their parsonage house as much as it is of the PCC of the parish in which the house is situated. So either one PCC in a benefice is privileged over another, or we're talking about perhaps 20 PCCs needing to consent to a technicality enabling a highway to be put through a bit of benefice land. The second is the provision around the priest in charge having this power during a vacancy in the benefice, which could have the unintended consequence of preventing the appointment of a priest in charge to exercise pastoral care of a benefice during a vacancy, when ongoing property transactions mean that it would be inadvisable to put in an incumbent who could potentially take decisions to change things which had already begun. That is the reality of the way property transactions sometimes have to happen. Priests in charge and suspensions of presentations to benefices often need to happen for precisely that reason. So for all these reasons, I would ask the Synod, if it wants to reverse many sections of the Church Property Measure 2018 and change the system whereby the bishop exercises powers over benefice property during a vacancy in the benefice, to do so. Otherwise, please resist the amendment.
So the steering committee is resisting the amendment. Therefore, I need to see 25 members or more standing, indicating or using a green tick in order for the debate to take place. There are more than 25 members, therefore the debate is now open. Remember that we're debating item 530 at this moment. Marcus Walker and then Adrian Greenfield. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Marcus Walker, London 168. I am delighted to follow Tom Wolford and perhaps to move this debate from the cuddlier end of Save the Parish to the cuddliest, to our archbishops, who have each at some point in the last year and a half said, I am Save the Parish, or I support Save the Parish. Both, over the course of the last year, have recognised the huge breakdown in trust that has happened between parishes and dioceses, and both have pledged at different times to work to ameliorate that breakdown of trust. This is an ideal opportunity to demonstrate that. Yes, there are many measures which in the past have granted powers to bishops during incumbencies to dispose of land, parsonage houses, and other things on behalf of, and sadly sometimes in the teeth of opposition from parishes and PCCs and priests in charge. This has seriously damaged the trust between people and the centre. This measure gives us an opportunity to make good that damage, to show from the centre that you've heard this problem and that you would like to work to improve the situation. What is the problem with approving this? If the PCC agrees with the disposal of this land for this highway, then everybody's happy. If the PCC doesn't, then there's trouble. And we want that trouble to be ironed out properly. Let's restore trust. Let's start the process of restoring trust. And I hope that I can invite Archbishop Stephen, who's here, and Archbishop Welby, Archbishop Justin, let's give them equality of name, who isn't, but will probably be here to the vote, to support this measure and to show that they would like to stand with the restoration of trust in our church.
Adrian Greenwood, then Penny.
Adrian Greenwood, Southwark, 415. Thank you for calling me Chair. And I want to say, as my bishop is sitting in front of me, that I fully trust him. I do want to raise a question of language, and that is to ask you, Synod, to consider what is it that is vacant when there is no incumbent in a parish. Is it the minds of the PCC that is vacant, I ask? It's incumbent on all organisations, including the Church of England, to keep its arrangements for governance under review. And we are actively involved in that. There's an item on the agenda tomorrow about the review of church governance, particularly affecting the Archbishop's Council. There is also an ongoing consultation regarding the role of bishops. That isn't on this Synod's agenda, but it is very important. And although the outcome is not yet clear, I'm discerning a shift, which I think a helpful shift, which will focus the role of bishops on mission, unity, evangelism, those sorts of spiritual and pastoral issues. And a greater emphasis, and it's absolutely clear in my own diocese of Southwark, on the role that the administrative and property and financial stuff is left to the diocesan secretary supported by their team. We'll see the outcome of the consultation as it goes forward. The Canterbury Diocesan Synod motion last summer put the spotlight on the governance of PCCs and raised a number of questions which I hope will be addressed by the Synod over the coming months. And for those of you who are eagle-eyed, you will notice that I submitted some amendments to the revision committee on the governance of PCCs. Unfortunately, they were rejected, but if you want to read it up, it's paragraphs 94 to 99. For me, this touches on the role of a PCC in relation to property and finance matters and to the importance of good process and good governance. And for all those reasons, I would ask that we support this amendment so that it's made clear that during a vacancy, the PCC is not vacant, it remains competent to deal with financial and property issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Penny, then the lady there, and after Penny, I'm going to reduce the speech limit to 3 minutes.
Penny Allen Lichfield 335. I must ask you not to support this amendment for very simple reasons. I am a member of the Glebe Committee, which looks at property and land within the Diocese of Lichfield. We have some very hard decisions to make sometimes about land and property, and sometimes they have to be made with a very commercial interest, and sometimes they have to be made with a very personal one. Sometimes properties have to be sold because rearrangements are taking place with parishes. Sometimes properties have to be sold because they are unfit for purpose. Sometimes properties have to be sold because we need to release for mission a different arrangement. Recently, we had a case where an entire property disposal of land was really held up because we couldn't provide a visibility display for entrance to that land because the land in question was inside a garden belonging to a parsonage. The parsonage was finding this difficult. We held up land worth millions of pounds, which we really needed to support our Darson funds, because we could not actually access this land easily. There are sometimes big conflicts between what we are recommended to do by our land agents, who are responsible for giving us the advice that we try to follow as much as we can, because in order to support our Darson funds, so that we support our parish priests by £10,000 each per year for each full-time post, in order to do that, we have sold some considerable amounts of land in the last few years. I want to support as many priests as possible. We have tried our utmost to facilitate a fund which enables us to continue to support ministry in our diocese. Conflicting commercial decisions are sometimes really difficult. We look at every aspect. We have a full report at Glebe Committee. We sit very seriously with those decisions. And I must ask you, please, to allow the diocese and the Darson bishop to continue to exercise this authority. Without that authority, some dioceses are going to lose money that's extremely important to them. And without this authority, and I do trust our bishops to give this authority in a trustworthy way, without this authority, you will be holding up processes which will impede our mission, prevent us from amassing certain capital funding, which we can use then for the mission in our diocese. It's really important that bishops retain this responsibility. Thank you.
Lady at the lectern, and then the gentleman over there.
Debbie,
Speech limit is now 3 minutes.
Debbie McIsaac, Salisbury 402. I want to address a comment that the Archdeacon made concerning a multi-parish benefice. In a multi-parish benefice, it's my understanding that the PCCs continue to have the legal personality, and while it may be multi, it's not a mega benefice where the parishes have been collapsed into one and have constituted a new PCC from the amalgamation of those parishes. So each of the parishes continues to have a PCC, and I think that's an important understanding that we should share. Thank you.
After the next speaker, I'm going to test the mind of Synod about closure of this debate. Thank you.
Simon Eyre, Chichester 287. This is an extension, really, of my question 139. I'm a church warden and lay chair of our PCC. In a benefice where a church has been left unoccupied for over 20 years and demolished 4 years ago, and we have a vicarage that has not been occupied for over 20 years, I can testify to the frustration that a PCC feels about the lack of power that they feel they have in this kind of situation. I think anything that can enhance the role of the PCC is to be welcomed, and I see this amendment as a small way forward in this way. The reform of the Church Property Act 2018, or measure, is perhaps a way forward, and obviously that would be for future discussion. But I would urge you to support this amendment, because it does at least give a pointer to giving PCCs a greater say in the disposal of church land. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm minded to end this debate here. All those who support me in that, please show. Thank you. Any against? Therefore, Mr. Walford, you have up to 3 minutes to respond on this item 530.
Thank you, Chair. Tom Wolford, Blackburn 070. Thank you, everyone, for contributing to the debate. First, the Archdeacon Douglas. The amendment was tabled with the full advice of the legal team, for which I'm very grateful. So I do think it's sound and would work. And if it's as insubstantial as Douglas said, then why resist it? I did wonder. Thank you, Marcus, for adding that this is an ideal opportunity to start to rebuild trust. Adrian's speech as well, thank you, that what is vacant in a vacancy is not the PCC. The PCC remains competent to deal with property and financial matters. Thank you. Penny's speech against the amendment, but this amendment still gives the bishop the necessary authority to act. It just means that the process has to start with the PCC, the people on the ground. So again, if it's a very obvious and good decision to make, there will be no additional hold-up. And Debbie, thank you for your clarifying comment on PCCs in multi-parish benefices. And Simon, thank you for your speech about this being a small step towards restoring agency in PCCs that often feel frustrated at the lack of agency, particularly in vacancies. So thank you. I do urge Synod to vote in favour of the amendment.
Thank you. So item 530 as on order paper 2 is now to be voted on. All those in favour of the amendment, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. I think it's not completely clear here. So I order a counted vote of Synod. You'll need your machines and cards. This is a counted vote of the whole Synod on item 530. Those present at Church House using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is now open. It will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
There voted in favour of the amendment 109, against 86, with 13 recorded abstentions. That item was therefore carried. Mr. Wolford, I now invite you to move item 531. That's perfect for me, thank you. I invite Venerable Douglas Detmer to respond to the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. Douglas Detmer, Exeter 117. The steering committee continues to have concerns about the amendment. However, as the point of principle has now been established, in order not to waste time further, we would not wish to oppose it and require the ensuing procedure.
As the steering committee now does not oppose this amendment, I will put this amendment to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. Item 532. Mr. Wolford, would you move that amendment? Thank you very much. Archdeacon Douglas, you have... You don't need to call thank you very much. I now put item 532 to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? Thank you very much. Item 533, could you move that one, please? It's getting shorter. I don't have to ask him. I therefore put that item 533 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. Item 534, Tom. Next is just the thumbs up, I think. That's all those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. Thank you. That is clearly carried. We therefore come to item 535, that clause 15 as amended stand part of the measure. So all those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. Thank you. We come to item 536, the stand part motion for clauses 16 to 18. As no member has indicated an intention to speak against the motion, item 536 is deemed carried. We move to item 537, the clause 19, stand part of the measure. Mr. Clive Billinus has given notice of his intention to speak against clause 19. So I call Mr. Hofmeyr to move item 537. He may speak for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Stephen Hofmeyr, Guildford 320. Mr. Billinus, as I understand it, opposes these provisions on the grounds that he considers they ought properly to be dealt with in a separate measure. The provisions themselves are explained at GS 2272X2, paragraphs 81 through to 87. These are important changes which need to be made now, and they're spelt out in those paragraphs, and I don't propose to deal with them. But the issue really before you is whether these provisions ought to be dealt with in a separate measure or in this measure, the steering committee unanimously rejects the contention that these matters should be excluded and dealt with in a separate measure. And our reason is that it would be wasteful of time and money for these matters not to be addressed now and in a miscellaneous provisions measure. In our view, this is an appropriate way to deal with these matters, and it would be most unfortunate if they were delayed and dealt with in a separate measure, which would take over a year to get through the General Synod. For these reasons, I would invite you to support Clause 19 and to reject Mr. Billinus's wish to have it removed.
Thank you. This item is now open for debate. Clive Billinus. You have up to 5 minutes, Clive.
Chair, thank you. Clive Billinus, 306, Diocese in Europe. Members, Chair, the reason I oppose this is because of a little hidden part of Clause 19(1)(4)(c). There is something about paragraphs 19 and me that seems to bring me to the podium on a regular basis, unfortunately. And this section extends the powers of delegation by the Church Commissioners down all the way to an individual or an officer. When we began the consideration of this, I remember Rebecca Chapman talking about what could be a worst-case scenario. And I consider, because by profession I'm a pessimist, that there are 3 misses involved in this. We have mistake, mischief, and misidentification. And mistake is a genuine error, but has a sibling, a misunderstanding. Because where this can go to an individual, there could be a genuine error if there's no other check. Mischief occurs when someone who's had delegated powers to make a decision does so without the best of intentions. And then we come to misidentification. We live in a world where so much is now done electronically. I ask all members of Synod to reflect whether or not they're completely certain that nobody else anywhere in the world has their identity or access to their electronic devices. So thinking back to Rebecca Chapman's comment about what's the worst case, well, this is a real worst case. The Charity Commission have about £10.5 billion of assets. So your worst case is the Charity Commissioners find themselves £10 billion poorer, but the proud owner of a handful of magic beans. And you can talk about checks and balances later in any of these systems, but to continue the nursery rhyme theme, in my world, subsequent precautions are known as Humpty Dumpty precautions because you're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after the event. And having once had to help a public authority reverse an £8 million fraud, believe me, it is very stressful trying to put Humpty back together again. It will be told to you that all charities have this kind of power. They do not. Unlimited delegation to any person, which is what this measure provides, is a vast power. Now, I'm the finance trustee of a charity with a budget which would fit nicely in the small change purse of the Church Commissioners. And when I defined my role, and with the full support of my trustees, I deliberately removed from my own power any financial authority to act on my own authority in relation to financial processes or expenditure. In my opinion, as the measure stands, the level of delegation goes too far, and this is why I beg to oppose this motion. Chair, Mr. Hofmeyr, thank you.
I see no one standing. Oh, sorry, I do see someone standing. Thank you.
Alan Smith, Church Commissioners 457. Mr. Billinus, thanks for raising it. You really bring out a very important point about how we are held to account. And I appreciate the challenge, but I will ask that Synod opposes it because why the root of this is actually to allow us to be a more effective steward of the Church's 10.1 billion funds. And the roots of this actually comes from a bond issue this year. when we came to to do that bond issue, first ever done in the church's history, our lawyers actually presented, we said, well, where do we show we have this power to do this? Our lawyers actually brought back the original 1704 Queen Anne's Bounty Act. We cannot steward an endowment fund on behalf of the church having to go back to a 320-year-old act. So this is all that this is doing. And alongside all of those procedures there, which actually do exist, is to formalize it and make it transparent. But actually alongside that, there are so many checks and balances. When we were in the heat of that deal, we actually had to refer back to a whole series of controls. We had to refer to a whole series of checks and balances in that. So I appreciate your challenge, but there's nothing sinister in there. Believe you me, the weight that the commissioners have and the weight that the Office of the First Church Estates Commissioner has no desire to bring more things on it. But we appreciate your challenge, and thanks for bringing it transparently in this way. But the backdrop of this is actually to make us more efficient in managing the funds today. Thank you.
I see no one standing, so Mr. Hofmeyr, oh, you're leaping up now. Debbie and then the gentleman over there, but 3 minutes now, please.
Thank you. Debbie McIsaac, Salisbury, 402. There are choices, of course, between reverting to 1702 or 1704 and implementing good and up-to-date governance. It is an anathema to good governance to see an individual exercising a function without some specific check or balance, and I think that's particularly so in this case. I would urge you to support this amendment.
Gentleman over there.
Ian Johnson, 387 Portsmouth. I'm a member of the reference group on the governance review. The major reason given for the governance review being in operation was that there are too many committees and it's too easy to form a committee. It strikes me that this item here, 19, gives absolute free license to committees being established almost willy-nilly. And it must be fundamentally wrong that we have a major piece of vision going through the governance review on the one hand, and we have the ability to create committees out of thin air on the other. I'm also reminded that the checks and balances that were referred to earlier did not stop the various frauds that we have noted in the recent past in various dioceses. I support Mr. Billings in this. I think it is absolutely right. I detect a kind of support for the revision committee. And I think, if I may say so, Synod needs to take a far more objective view of these things and its own mind. I would support this amendment. Thank you.
I do now see no one standing, so I invite Stephen Hofmeyr to respond to the debate. Stephen, you have up to 3 minutes.
Thank you. Stephen Hofmeyr, Guildford 320. Synod, this is not an amendment. What is being proposed is that clause 19 is removed in its entirety from the measure. I just want you to be absolutely clear in what you're being invited to do. The 1947 measure already allows for delegation to officers, and it has done since inception in 1947. This has not been an issue. This provision in clause 1, clause 1, subsection, relates to the point that is being made by Mr. Billines relates to he would like to see an amendment to one part of one of the provisions. The appropriate course would have been for that to have been brought by way of an amendment, so that the amendment could then be debated without interfering with all the other provisions which he is not concerned with, which are contained in clause 19. So this is not an amendment. The measure has always allowed delegations to officers, and if there is to be a debate on the question of delegation, then now is not the right place to have that debate. We need to have that debate in the context of an overall consideration in a governance context of the extent to which delegation is appropriate or not appropriate. Thank you to Alan Smith for explaining to us the background to these proposals and why they're being included in the miscellaneous provision measure and why they're necessary and why they're necessary now. Thank you also to Ms. MacIsaac and Mr. Johnson for the points you make. But I fear those points would relate to an amendment if it were opposed, not to what is before you now, which is whether this clause should be rejected in full or whether it should be accepted. And as I say, if there is to be a debate on the principle of delegation, now is not the place to have that debate. And for these reasons, I would invite you to support clause 19 forming part of the miscellaneous provisions measure.
Thank you for that. So we are voting on item 537, that clause 19 stand part of the measure. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. That is clearly carried. We come to item 538, the stand part motion for clauses 20 to 23. As no member has indicated an intention to speak against those clauses, item 538 is deemed carried. We then move to item 539, the stand part motion for schedules 1 and 2. Again, as no one has indicated an intention to speak, that item is deemed carried. Finally, we move to item 540, that the long title stand part of the measure, which is also deemed to be carried. Synod, that completes the revision stage for the draft Church of England miscellaneous provisions measure, which now stands committed to the steering committee in respect of its final drafting. And thank you very much. We now move to the next item of business.
Thank you, Synod. We come to item 511. I'm just going to tell you how we're going to manage this item of business in layperson's terms first. We're going to discuss whether to agree to consider the parochial fees order 2023. Then we will look at the amendments. And finally, we will look at the order as amended or not for approval. So we come to item 511A, the Draft Parochial Fees Amendment Order 2023, which is to be considered under the preliminary motion procedure set out in Standing Order 73. Members will need the draft order GS 2288 and the explanatory notes GS 2288X, and also Order Paper 4, which sets out the amendments which have been received. Synod should be aware that there is a financial implication for this item, for which the detail is set out in the 14th notice paper. I would like to invite Mr. John Spence to move item 511A, the preliminary motion, that the draft parochial fees order be considered. He has up to 10 minutes.
John Spence, Archbishop's Council 467. When the parochial fees order was agreed in 2019 to last from 2020 to 24, it was intended to be helpful to diocesan boards of finance and parochial church councils in enabling them to do their budgeting. They would know by the August of each year what the CPI was, and on that basis they would know that the fees would increase in line with the CPI, rounded up to the nearest pound. Nobody then could have envisaged that in August 2022, the CPI increase would be 9.9%. And so if we allow the current order to stand, that is where the fees have already gone up from the 1st of January, and that will continue to be the increase. This matter was brought to the attention of the Archbishop's Council Finance Committee and the Archbishop's Council at the end of last year. As an economist, I would argue that there may or may not be a price elasticity of demand. Would somebody, for instance, be less likely to be married in church because the fee had gone up from £480 to £528 than they would be if the fee went up from £480 to £504? But the point is, it was about the message that it sends. We would be saying to those people who wish to come to church for their services, we are passing on the full considerable increase in the consumer price index, while at the same time we have only increased the recommended stipends of the priests who will be undertaking those ceremonies by 5%. And it was the conclusion of the Archbishop's Council that this just did not feel equitable, and that we should therefore bring this amendment before you today. And that is what we ask you to do, to agree that the fees for the rest of this year, so we can lay the order immediately after you've agreed it into Parliament, and then it will come into force, that we ask you to agree that the fees for this year should be the less of CPI or 5%, so by definition that will be 5%, given that it's based on August last year, and that for 2024, again, the fee increase should be 5% or CPI increase, whichever is the lower. Now, I do need to say to you that I'm going to have to resist the amendments that have been moved. Firstly, it seems to me in principle that if somebody is recommending a much bigger increase than CPI, as is in the case of Ian's amendment, or if one is moving a difference, a change in the split between diocesan boards of finance and parochial church councils, the right way to do that is as the result of a proper consultation. Given that the current order in any case expires at the end of 2024, we will need to undertake that consultation over the next 12 months in order to bring you a new order to apply from the 1st of January 2025 in a year's time. But secondly, I've been given advice from our officials that we can only, as a synod, agree the amendment as is presented to you today. If any amendment is made to that, then that will have to be referred back to Archbishop's Council for a future meeting. They can either then accept the amendment and lay the order in Parliament at that time, which will mean at least a delay of probably 2 more months, or they can resist that amendment, in which case they would have to accept that this order is lost and they would have to bring completely new proposals to you, which could be done no sooner than July 2023. So basically, we're given something of a difficult choice here. We ask you to accept the amendment, accept the amendment order, which will reduce the increase to be applied across the rest of this year and across 2024 to the numbers I have quoted, or else if you choose to move any of the amendments or to resist the amendment order completely, then the 9.9%, amended upwards, so it's 10% plus, will apply and will continue to apply across this year, and with next year's increase being whatever CPI is in August 23. So I do hope that that is very clear. I look forward very much to receiving the views of Synod on this, and I move the motion in my name.
The motion at item 511A is now open for debate. This is the opportunity for general debate on the draft order as laid before the Synod. If after any debate the motion is carried, we will move to the amendments. Yes, please go ahead. And then after.
Darren Miller, Canterbury 75. Thank you, Chair, for calling me for my maiden speech. I do feel possibly a little bit of a heel bringing this speech before Synod, not least in the light of the work that we did earlier today. However, I need to oppose this amendment order, not because what it aims to do is wrong, but I very much feel that this is the wrong way to achieve it. In a time when the cost of living is a crisis, it's important for the Church to do its bit to help everybody, but this is not the way. For many, the saving to each individual will be, frankly, a token. A little over £25 for a marriage that has probably cost many of the people coming to our churches thousands. The problem with this order is that it's neither focused nor nuanced. It's a blanket cut, taking no account of someone's circumstances or ability to pay the full fee. The cost of living is also affecting our churches, putting stressors on local budgets. Additionally, this change, and I'm sorry if I missed anything that came our way to the dioceses and parishes, is unexpected and comes months after parishes and dioceses have set budgets for this current year. Many, if this is considered and passed, will suffer income cuts that will make a real difference in their ability to serve, not least in their ongoing social impact projects, those we heard about earlier. As an example, a benefice in my archdeaconry that currently struggles financially, if this goes through as stands, will lose over £1,100 this year. The Diocese of Canterbury, which has the second fewest historic resources to draw upon, in the most listings it's the second poorest in the country. That means that we have to try and balance our budget each year, and it can be a pretty close run thing. We'll be losing £21,500. That's the equivalent of half a stipended post, which we've not budgeted for and cannot afford. Notice paper 5, which we only received on Friday, makes it clear that the effect of this order will be a centrally imposed revenue cut to parishes and dioceses of some £3.6 million. That's in a time, as I said, when our local budgets are already hard-pressed. Most importantly, this amendment order is unnecessary. Parishes already have the right to waive PCC and DBF fees where there is real hardship. And I know from my own work in my area where we have some of the most deprived communities in the country, with rural poverty rife, coastal poverty, and lots of different areas where there are challenge, parishes do waive fees. We need to trust them to do so where that is the appropriate thing, where those who can afford can pay the full increase, and where those who can't afford are known by their local parish, who can then exercise their right to waive a fee where that is the appropriate thing to do. A blanket revenue cut to our parishes and dioceses is not the way to help people in need. We need to be able to trust our parishes to make those decisions for themselves, to make a difference where they can, that's real for them and those whom they serve. And if we need to remind parishes that they can do this, then let's do so. But I urge us not to do it by this blanket cut across the board that will do more harm than it intends to do good. Thank you, Synod.
Thank you. The speech limit is now 3 minutes. Mr. Chris Gill.
Thank you. Chris Gill, Lichfield, 338. Thank you for calling me, Chair. I declare an interest in this item as both the Treasurer of my church and as a trustee of the Diocesan Board of Finance. As an accountant, I like a good process, a system for calculating fees which is robust, fair and equitable, and timely. But to my mind, the proposed fees order lacks all three attributes. The introduction of a cap may be reasonable, particularly as a significant proportion of the fee relates to the time cost of clergy. And at 5%, the cap mirrors the increase in the national stipends benchmark from April 2023. But what about next year? If the increase in the stipend benchmark is some other figure, will there be a proposal to change the cap again? Then there is the embarrassing issue of timing, and the fact that introducing reduced rates at this point in the year, or whenever the order commences, would mean that people being charged the reduced fees will be paying less than those who were charged earlier in the year. Can this be fair? Would we be morally bound to reimburse part of the fees charged in the first part of this year? Chair, it might be that the fees are too high, but I would suggest that this is not the way to rectify the matter. And it may be better for the Archbishop's Council to go away and do more work on this in time for the determination of the 2024 fees. I would ask Synod to vote against the draft order. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Reverend Flintoft, and then Gavin Drake.
Thank you. Ian Flintoft, Newcastle 176. Thank you for calling me for my maiden speech. I speak in favour of the draft order. I speak as a passionate advocate of the part of the occasional offices can play in our ministry of love and service and in the sensitive proclamation of the gospel to those who live in our parishes. I have the privilege of ministering in a parish where people still turn to the church for these offices and have just finished a run of 12 funerals between Christmas and last week. What I say relates specifically to funeral fees, but some of it is applicable more widely. Yes, the amounts we're talking about are small. Yes, they represent only a small proportion of the total costs of a funeral. Yes, there are other things that we can do to ensure that people turn to us at these key moments of life, like replying promptly to funeral directors, responding sensitively and creatively to families' requests, and offering good follow-up in pastoral care. But I do believe the changes proposed in this order are for the good. The community theologian Anne Morrissey speaks of cascades of grace. She means those often small acts of generosity and grace we can do, which in turn often provoke further acts of grace and generosity from others, and sometimes turn into a cascade. The proposals we're debating today might be that first act of grace, prompting the generosity of a bereaved family and perhaps even of others in the funeral industry as they reflect on what it is just to be charging for their services during cost of living crisis. So I support this order, and I ask us to continue to be attentive to the missional value of this part of our ministry to our nation. Thank you.
Mr Gavin Drake.
Thank you. Gavin Drake, Sutherland, Nottingham, 421. We've heard earlier, I think somebody yesterday talked about a lack of memory. So in case there's a lack of memory is widespread in the Synod, can I remind you that we have just passed a motion that says we are mindful of the impact of the deepening cost of living crisis on ordinary people. This draft amendment to the fees order is a way in which this Synod, this Church, can do something about that practically. It's time that we walk our talk. Please, let's have this debate and let's pass this amendment order. Thank you.
Yes.
Robert Shaw, 217 Sheffield, and I've just had to run, so I might be out of breath. It's just occurred to me to just mention how many times I'm now dealing with families who have had their family members have a direct cremation because of cost, and the upset that that is causing when a family realise they can't even attend a funeral. I think it's so vital that we are able to keep our fees as low as possible so that we can serve families who are in need and who may increasingly choose a direct cremation as an alternative to a funeral, and this is not something that we should be encouraging. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Paul Ayres, Leeds 131. Although my Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer of our DBF have said that they're content with this, I do just want to respond to those previous couple of speeches about generosity. I think when people speak about generosity, they need to be aware that they're being generous with other people's money. It isn't that this money doesn't need to be found. It's that it needs to be found, if not by the fees, it needs to be found basically through parish share. And so they're being generous with money that has to be given by other ordinary people who are regular worshippers. I think we should keep that in mind when we are, as we're often urged to do, give things away. Who is it that's actually doing the giving? Thank you.
I see no one else standing, so I would like to invite Mr Spence to reply.
Oh, you really would think I should be able to find my own way after doing it so many times, but there we go. Thanks to David. Thank you very much for actually a very short but a really terrific debate. There were two notable maiden speeches from me. Darren, I agree with so much of what you said and your sentiment. The only words with which I really disagreed was the piece centrally imposed. Actually, this is a real test of democracy. Archbishop's Council will do what Synod directs us to do as a result of this debate. Chris, I do appreciate what you said about timeliness, but given the CPI increase was only in August, and the last time Synod met was in July, when the earliest available figures were very different, there wasn't much we could do about it, as we are required to come back to Synod if we wish to amend the order in the other way. But the other maiden speech was Ian's. And I do love that phrase, the cascade of Paul, that we are potentially spending other people's money. But it just seems to me so important about the signals that we send, as Eleanor said, in terms of funerals. We understand where you are. Yes, we understand it will cause us an issue. What the financial impact will be, as I say, who would know whether anybody or how many people would change their plans because of the scale of the increase? I look forward, as do my colleagues in Archbishop's Council, to receiving the will of Synod on this matter. If you approve the amendment order, we will act accordingly. If you choose not to, then, of course, we will have to consider what further order we might bring in future. But I thank you very much for the debate.
Thank you. I now put this item 511A to the vote with a show of hands. All those in favour? And green ticks on Zoom. Thank you. All those against? We have one on Zoom. That's carried. Thank you very much. I'm going to make a request to Synod to extend this sitting by up to 15 minutes if we need it to finish this business. Could I have a show of hands in favour? Thank you. And against? That's carried. Thank you very much, Synod. We now come to the amendments. I call on the Reverend Marcus Walker to move his first amendment at item 541. He may speak for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. Marcus Walker, London 168. I come before Synod by way of a public confession. And in the manner of a confession, I suppose I have both a confession and then, how did it go? No, the bit before penance. Act of contrition and then my act of penance. The confession is that a fat thumb and an attempt to copy from a PDF into an email meant that what I wanted to do was not in fact done for this amendment, which was to ensure that funerals taken in crematoria would have the fees split in the same way that funerals undertaken in churches are split. Even I did not wish to denude the diocesan boards of finance of all of the revenues of the hard work of the parish clergy across the country. I did not do this, and I confess this before the Synod. My act of contrition, therefore, is to withdraw my amendments. My penance, however, is after conversation with John Spence. He has invited me and others who are interested in this to be part of the conversations, to be as to what the fees should look like after 2025 and how there can be a fairer and more equitable division between the monies going to the parish council and the monies going to the diocesan board of finance, because it is only fair that the hard work of the parish clergy is reflected in the monies that go to the parishes and to the diocese. But I therefore withdraw my amendments.
As Mr. Walker has withdrawn his amendments, we move straight to Amendment 543. Would the Venerable Ian Bishop like to speak to his amendment?
Chair.
Thank you.
Ian Bishop, Chester 88. Synod, what I'm proposing here is actually a very simple change to the parochial fees, or at least I hope it's simple. I don't mean to cause legal difficulties. I'm standing here following a conversation I had with a treasurer of a small rural church. He's trying to do his best to manage their almost full churchyard. The church is coming under some pressure from the local community to extend the churchyard, but as he said to me, we'd like to help, but we can't afford it. We have on average 2 burials a year, and the income we get from that won't even pay to cut the grass. Our volunteers are exhausted and getting older, and so we have to buy in help. So why would we extend the churchyard? But if we don't, I fear the criticism we will get from people in the village who expect to be buried there will damage our mission. Now, I don't think that church is unique. Indeed, I think most of our small rural parishes can't cover the cost of churchyard maintenance from the fees they receive. But they have huge problems of management, and they put up with abuse from everyone who thinks they should do a better job. We all know the stories of parishes publicly criticised for clearing makeshift shrines or for not keeping the place neat and tidy. I want to say that I support the principle that underpins these fees, that we should keep fees low for those financially struggling in our society. We recognise the very high costs that the public experience at weddings and funerals, and we want to make these very important pastoral and community events affordable and missional. So I endorse that aim, but I don't really want to support the cap on fees for the very good reasons that Darren Miller said earlier. But the fact is, I think that the base level of parochial fees operating since 2019 isn't really working for small rural churches. So can I suggest an increase in just one particular element that I think would make a bit of a difference? I'm asking that the fee for the burial of a body should increase from just under £400 to £1,000 to help struggling parishes afford the cost of churchyard maintenance. Leave the rest of the fees alone, preferably without the cap, because the principle of lower fees is still in place, but increase the fee for the burial of a body. You can still inter ashes very cheaply. You can still have a church service very cheaply. But if you want the privilege of taking significant space in the churchyard, then you should pay a reasonable figure. And if you think that the increase I'm suggesting is excessive, please just note that the Church of England would still be well below the local authority and private cemetery costs. In my own area of Cheshire East, a pretty average area of the country, you'd pay £2,200 for a single depth grave. So I'm suggesting a figure less than half of our local authority rate. And if you go to the nice private burial ground at Adlington Hall, just outside Macclesfield, well, it'll be double that as well. The fact is, we are miles below the market. Now, I do understand why we apply such low fees, and I'm the last person who wants to see us charging excessively so that only the wealthy can afford full body burial. But don't forget, we always have the option of waiving fees, as we've already heard, for those in financial hardship. And the figure here, suggested here in this motion, isn't fair on the parishes asked to look after the bodies that want burying. It may, of course, lead to people opting for the then much cheaper cremation and interment of ashes. But wouldn't that be a good thing? Much better use of the diminishing space in our burial grounds, easier to maintain and more environmentally sensible. This is a small change that I'm asking for. But for many small churches, it might just make a big difference. So please come on, Synod, throw a few parishes a lifeline and support this amendment standing in my name.
Thank you. I would like to invite Mr. Spence to respond to this amendment.
Chairman, to save time and elegance, if I can reply from here. Ian makes good points. If we are worried about the reputation, I wonder how a recommended increase of 300% nearly would appear to the outside population. But I come back, Ian, we cannot, if we ask to look at this one measure alone, will have the impact of requiring the whole order to be referred back to Archbishop's Council, with a delay of at least 2 more months for enactment, I would think. Secondly, the right thing to do is for us to be involved in a full consultation and conversation exercise over the coming months so that such good arguments as you made can be considered properly. And just as I've invited Marcus to be involved in that, and by golly, how amazing that even Marcus can make a mistake. Ian, I say to you, you're very warmly welcome to come into that dialogue. Let's have a full inclusive conversation and make sure that we create a fee structure from 2025 onwards that really satisfies everybody in terms of splits, in terms of fee levels and so on. I thank you very much for the amendment, but I must resist it.
Thank you. The amendment will lapse unless 25 members stand. I don't see 25 members standing. The amendment therefore lapses. We come straight to item 511B. That the draft parochial fees amendment order 2023 be approved. Would Mr. Spence like to speak to this item?
Chair, I'm happy to move the amendment. Move the motion.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
John Mason, Chester, 280. I'm entirely in favour of this amendment. And I note the basis on which it is based is that it should reflect the costs and the fact that the recommended stipend increase is only 5%, which is why we're capping it at 5%. I just would wonder whether or not we could be reassured that in the unlikely but potential situation that the stipend were increased 1 year by more than the CPI, that we would be seeking potentially to set the fees at that higher level.
Yes, Mr. Gavin Drake.
Thank you. Gavin Drake, Sutherland, Nottingham, 421. Please excuse me as I just open up. This is a speech that I had written to oppose the amendment that has lapsed, but I'm going to tweak it for the general purpose of this. I want to talk about my own experiences of the Church's funeral care in 2017, because I then want to address some of the points that were made earlier. In our first item of business today, as I said, we were mindful of the impact of the deepening cost of living crisis on ordinary people, and we recalled our Lord's commitment to those who were hungry or lacked the essentials of life. I am happily married. I have 3 wonderful adult children and 4 amazing stepchildren, and the future is bright. But the life that I have now looked impossible in January 2017, when my first wife died in hospital 2 days after collapsing at home. She'd had a stroke. Julie was 51. Her death was unexpected. I was devastated. My whole life and world imploded. And in 2017, I did very little work. I was self-employed, and this had a major impact on finances. My family and I were supported by the church, not only by my vicar, but by the Dean of Lichfield, who made his wonderful cathedral in Staffordshire available for the funeral. The Bishop of Wolverhampton offered his personal support, as did priests from a number of my former parishes. I was supported by members of one of my former churches who set up a rota to deliver meals on wheels to feed my boys and me. A former lay member of that church had become a curate of another nearby church, and members of that church who did not know me also set up a Meals on Wheels rota and fed my boys and me for another week. And also the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, on one of the few pieces of work that I did do in 2017, reporting on his visit to Jerusalem, Israel and Palestine for the Church Times and others, he took time out of his busy schedule on that trip to talk with me, to console with me, and to pray for me. When I was overcome with grief, the church was there for me and got me through 2017. I'm concerned when we talk about fees as for funerals in particular, as a way of funding parish life. I'm concerned about it because the bereaved in particular, and I know the fees cover weddings and so on as well, but particularly fees for funerals, we're talking about somebody having to pay them at the lowest, potentially the lowest point of their lives. Not everyone who is bereaved will receive the same extent of love and care from the church that I received. But if we put fees up, many people will receive no care from the church. We shouldn't price ourselves out of our calling to bless those who mourn. There are ways in which churchyard costs can be met, working with parish councils, that's civil parish councils and others, to help with those costs. I know some churchyards extended, not by extending the churchyard, but by buying a civil cemetery next to it and combining them so that the people there don't know whether they're in the churchyard or the civil cemetery. There are ways in which this can be done, and I encourage Synod and the Church to address ways in which we can fund funeral ministry without using it as a tax on those who grieve. Thank you.
I see no one else standing. Would Mr. John Spence like to respond?
Again, speak from here, Chair. Thank you. And to John, please be assured this order, if the amendment order, if agreed, will only apply for 23 and 24. There will be no question of fees rising by more than CPI in that time, as it will be the lower of CPI or 5%. All our expectations are that by August this year, CPI will be rising by less than 5%, and so that will be the fee level. Gavin, can I just thank you for sharing us that very sad story, and yet an inspiring story of the support you received. And it is just worth reflecting that while the numbers here seem huge, the entire income to the entire Church of England from parochial fees at 65 million is less than 10% of that which comes in from parish share. And the financial impact as laid out in your memorandum, even if the increased fees at 9%, 10% would have no impact on demand, is less than half of 1% of that parish share figure. I very rarely suggest to you something that will reduce income. I do so on behalf of Archbishop's Council now, and I ask you to agree the Parish Fee Amendment Order 2023.
Thank you. I now put this item to the vote that the draft parochial fees amendment order 2023 be approved. All those in favour, please show. And ticks on Zoom. Thank you. All those against? Thank you. This item is carried. Thank you.
Say that the draft amendment canon number 43 will now be taken.
I can now say that the draft amending canon number 43 will now be taken at another sitting.
No, be taken now.
Oh, sorry, will be taken now. Thank you very much.
Before commencing the next item and getting to our lunch break, Synod, I've been asked to remind members to return handsets to the charging stations during lunchtime because we want them to be fully charged for this afternoon. Thank you. We now come to items 544 and 545, draft amending canon number 43, for which you'll need GS 2273A. We come to the item at the revision stage for the drafting amending canon 43. Members will recall that the Synod took note of the report of the revision committee for this amending canon on Tuesday morning. Seems a long time ago. Point of order, thank you, we'll just count. Can I invite bishops to stand or indicate their presence in another way? Thank you, that's much quicker. We are, we need 9. 9?
I've got my cardboard.
We are quorate, you'll be pleased to note. Thank you, thank you. Because the report related to both a measure and a canon, under Standing Order 57 4A, which is a new standing order, I must first call on a member of the revision committee to move that the draft amending canon 43 miscellaneous provisions do proceed to the revision stage. I call on the chair of the steering committee, Mr. Stephen Hoffmeyer, to move that motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Stephen Hoffmeyer, Guildford 320. I formally move that the draft amending canon number 43 miscellaneous provisions do proceed to the revision stage.
Thank you. The standing orders require me to put this motion to a vote without a debate, so I will do that now. Zoomers, you're invited to use your ticks and crosses in the usual way. But for those of us in the chamber, can I also have your indication? Those in favour, please show. Those against? That is carried. We now come to item 545, the stand part motion for paragraphs 1 to 16 of the draft canon. As no member has indicated a wish to speak against those paragraphs, item 545 is deemed carried. That completes the revision stage for the draft amending canon 43 miscellaneous provisions, which now stands committed to the steering committee in respect of its final drafting. That concludes this item of business. Thank you.